I'm originally from Ireland, as was my father and his ancestors. Originally, they were among the wealthiest people in the country, until the Blight hit. After its rampage, my ancestors slowly moved from poverty and into what I would say is upper middle class to the lower part of the upper class. Not really rich, but enough to indulge in expensive things, like boats and art. Tired of the constant harassment from the English folk in his hometown and in Britain itself where he frequently visited to do business, he moved to the United States in 1948. He originally served in the Second Great War and was a hero amongst his comrades, saving their lives from the likes of the Germans and Japanese forces. After serving there, he settled in Massachusetts, where he got a job at a police station about a half-mile from Worcester, which only accepted him because he was a smart guy and could easily tell if somebody was lying. There, he worked on several cases, even on the infamous Whitney Bulger case. However, he got bored and he soon moved down south to a relatively decent-sized town about an hour from Dallas. There, he was one of, if not the best in the force. He would always wear a dark suit jacket, light brown leather pants, and dark shoes fit with a blue tie. His green eyes, dark brown hair, tall and slightly muscular build, was enough to make you question if you should even spit at him. But I'm getting off track. One night when he was finishing his paperwork, he received a letter from a man named Emil Powers. Emil told him in the letter that his daughter was missing, and attached was a sketch of the abductor, or what looked like him. Till morn, he thought to himself. When his boss, Mr. E, arrived at the office, he immediately told him about the letter. Despite not having a good relationship with Mr. E, my father could tolerate him. E was a notorious supporter of some bad doings in the area, which my father hated with all his heart and soul, since he had experienced it firsthand in England and even in Texas. Well, son, this ain't nothing like I ever seen since I was a small feller. Why did you put it aside and focus on another case? One regarding not them, he said. Well, I would prefer this case, my father answered. Mr. E knew there was no change in my father's mind. He was taller and not willing to take any of his crap, but still, he stood firm. You guys are always so firm like stone. That's why I like you, and that's why you got the job. You ain't willing to back down even if the odds are against you 99-1. Heck, if I said no, you could have sued my butt. I'm not willing to take that chance to an Irish drunk guy either. Mr. E shrugged. My father could take it. I mean, he had been called worse before. Instead of saying anything back, he just stared blankly at him. I shall do as you wish, he replied. Work on that case when you're complete with your other. Now get the heck out of my office before I cut your paycheck, Mr. E shouted. My father from now on will call him Liam, our family's most common name, left the office and sat at his desk. He began his work on a disappearance of a 14-year-old girl who had vanished seemingly without so much as a trace just days prior to him joining the police. Attached was a sketch of the person who was supposedly responsible for the disappearance. Little did he know that what he was dealing with was the work of a madman, or as others say, a serial killer. Liam worked day in and day out, up at 4 in the morning and leaving at 11 p.m., never wishing to be late and always giving us goodnight hugs while we slept like logs outside a cabin, waiting to be chopped and hauled into the burning flames that keep humanity warm. His reasoning was that crime never sleeps, and so neither should he. I wanted to let him sleep so I could take care of his work, but he told me to follow my own dreams. I knew that I couldn't convince my old man, so I let him be. One day, he came across a link between his previous case, the one involving the 14-year-old girl's disappearance, and Emmy's letter. He noticed that both of the victims described in the cases were last seen near telephone poles and The sketches of these supposed abductors were eerily similar. Both had the same nose, the same hairstyle, around shoulder length, had a green 1963 Chevy pickup truck, and eerily similar license plates, with the last number being either a 5 or a 6 or a 9. Maybe it was just another coincidence like he had received several times, but this, it was all too similar. He drove to Emil's address and knocked on the door. A skinny, slightly shorter than my father, African-American man came out and asked Liam what he had wanted. "Is Mr. Emil Powers home? I'd like to speak with him," he asked. "Why the heck would he go with someone like you? You folk ain't supposed to be among other," the man had responded. "I didn't know that. I ain't from around here, so sorry," Liam had answered. "Then where you from, boy?" he asked. "Ireland. I moved here to escape harassment, but it seems that it's here too," Liam answered. "Oh, you ain't seen nothing yet. The worst is yet to come. Now excuse me if I burst your bubble. Emil, get your butt downstairs right this minute. Some person here wants to speak with ya," the man shouted. "Come, Darius," a voice likely Emil said. Suddenly a man roughly Darius's height came rushing down the steps. He carried his suit jacket in one arm and papers in the other. "Sorry, I had to get some paperwork done for my daughter's funeral. You must be with the police squad," Emil had asked. "I am, and I'm sorry for your loss. Now, I'm here to discuss the letter that you wrote. Where was she last seen, as in her location?" Liam asked. "Berkeley's near the post office. I told her to give me some chips for a barbecue that we were going to have. I waited for about an hour since there was a lot of flavors there. It don't take her an hour to choose, so I thought that she was saying hi to her friends who were at their house without my knowledge. So when I called and they told me that she wasn't there, said somebody who claimed to be a relative had got her, but went the opposite of this place," Emil had answered. Liam asked several more questions, but I could never remember them. He thanked Emil and he left. He headed back to his office and sat down with the new information that he had received. He placed both cases on his desk, side by side. Liam looked at the cases, papers upon papers of the case files, descriptions, background, and other unimportant things that didn't matter to him. He worked until he fell asleep at his desk. At around 8 a.m., he was woken up by his boss. "The heck you doing sleeping on the job?" he shouted. "Sorry, sir, I lost track of time from doing work too late," he replied. "Tell that to me when I lose track of your dang paychecks," Mr. E spat. Liam said nothing, but just went back to reading the cases, but trouble was brewing for him. So he decided to visit Emil and the other family, the Antonios. First, he visited Emil at his workplace, a diner named V's. You again, what do you want from me? Can't you read the sign?" Emil asked. Liam looked at the side reading, colored only. I mean, it was still the mid-60s and the Civil Rights Act was months away. "I don't care for signs, they're just words. Also, those folks wouldn't want a drunk like me," Liam smirked. "You, sir, are a strange fellow. I'm surprised that you don't go for the whites-only places," Emil said. "I've never done so. Those people treat me differently because I have a different frickin' voice," Liam added. "Dang, son, well, what can I get ya?" Emil asked. Just a cheeseburger, fries, and a Coke. Oh, and a chocolate milkshake," he answered. "All right, coming right up," Emil replied. As the food was cooking, Liam took out his notebook and a pen. "I have some questions. First one. What was the last number on the license plate that supposedly took your daughter?" "Well, from what I could gather, the numbers seem to be 5, 6, or 9. I need to know what the number is," Liam asked. "I don't know nothing. From what I could get, some man who saw the whole dang encounter saw the plates and said the number was a 5. Another who saw it said it was a 6. And my brother said it was a 9. Well, I think it was a 5 from what I made out," Emil answered. He placed the food in front of Liam, and Liam began eating it. "So, you don't eat a lot of fast food?" Emil asked. Not really. I usually eat my sandwich around this time, but duty took me here, Liam answered. He looked around to see other people coming in. Emil, why you little white folk in here? A man asked. Oh, I'm here on official business. Do any of you know anything about the disappearance of his daughter? Liam replied. The place went silent. No one made a sound. The people looked at each other and soon one man stepped forward. Well, I do remember one thing. I was doing some yard work with my parents and I remember when I was getting some water from the hose in the back of the house. There's a road there and one in the front. When I was done, I'd heard an ear-piercing scream. After I dropped the bucket, I saw the truck, which is where you got the description from. I managed to get a single photo before the truck sped off. After that, I called the police, but said it was nothing. The man said. Well, that can do some good, Liam added. He left after finishing his food, and he soon went to the Antonio's house. After knocking on the door, a short Italian man came to it. What can I do for ya? He asked. Is Anthony home? Liam asked. Yeah, here he is. Boy, get your butt down here this frickin' instant or you're gonna see Mars, the man yelled. Yeah, Dad, another man's voice said. He stumbled down the stairs. Oh, great, another drunk cop. Get out of here, Anthony sighed. I'm only gonna ask you some questions. Now, where were you when your sister was taken from this place? Liam had asked. I don't know. Why don't you ask my fist? Anthony asked. Hey, the man his father spat. Fine, I'll answer. I was out with some friends just chilling at Vito's. All of a sudden we got ourselves some tough guy who wanted to take us for some fun. We say no and he insists that we do. After about several minutes of this crap, he snaps and he drives off and takes off towards my place. I think you don't want to go to my place, but that was a big mistake. As soon as I get back, my sister's gone. The truck looked the same as the one that I saw at Vito's, as Pops had described. Anthony explained. Did either of you see the license plate? What was the last number of it? Liam asked. The one that I saw was a 6. The father Will had answered. Well, I saw a 9. Anthony answered. Thank you for your time. If you have anything more, please let me know, Liam said. As he left, Anthony flipped up his middle finger. Trash, he shouted. Liam just shrugged his head. He drove home to continue his work in his office. As he turned left, right, and then left out of the street near his, he noticed something from the corner of his eye. He pulled over and saw a truck battered and in a ditch behind several trees. How in the world did I miss this? He asked himself. He called Emil to tell him of the truck's location. I'll be there in the morning, it's late. Maybe this can lead to my daughter. God, I hope so, he said. The next morning, Emil arrived and saw the truck. My God, he said. Will and Anthony were soon called and Anthony soon was flooded with that night. The man from the restaurant was soon called and was brought before the truck. Both remembered it and correctly identified it as the truck that they saw. The only question is, who owns it or who stole it? Emil had said. I'll work on that now, Liam answered. Thank you. I owe my life to you, pal, Emil added. If I can ask for you if I need you, like Batman and Robin, Liam replied. He drove off to find out who owned that particular green truck. It would take him a great many weeks to find the one though. Emil came home and decided to explore the woods behind his house. He took his shotgun and he ventured with his dog into the forest. As Emil readied his gun, his dog barked loudly and Emil left his gun in his spot. He ran over to the canines howling, tripping over twigs and fallen branches and other things on the Texas forest floor. Oh, what are you barking at? What is... Jesus Christ, Emil shouted. What is it, hon? His wife Susan had asked. Come see this, he answered. Susan wept and screamed as soon as she saw the bodies in the trees. The police took what they found back to the autopsy room, and there they were identified as Emil's long-lost daughter Francine and Will's daughter Viviana. Both bodies showed no signs of anything else, but it was concluded they were both killed by blunt force. They appeared to have been placed there, so the location of the killings were unknown. Liam was called, and he knew this was the work of a madman. Liam soon arrived at Emil's house. He barged past him with a force like that of a train hitting an elephant. He arrived in the woods and he saw the tree, which the two bodies were found in. There were still stains on the bark of the tree. Liam put his fingers on the bark, the red seeping onto his fingers. "Jesus," he said. "Whoever the heck did this is a monster, and I want their dang head on a spike," Emil shouted. The police looked at Liam, wanting him to think of something. "Analyze this. I'm going to a car dealership, one that sells these," he said. He looked inside the truck for anything useful. There was next to nothing except for some receipts, a knife, a .22 caliber, and another paper that had the faint words barely reading, "Fabio's Garage." Or that's what he thought he saw in the paper. Liam drove to Fabio's garage. He exited his blue 1965 Ford Mustang and approached the owner named Fabio. "How can I help you today?" Fabio asked. "Do you perhaps know of somebody who bought a green 1963 Chevy pickup truck?" he asked. Sorry, I've had several people buy the same truck. Be a little more specific, okay?" Fabio replied. Liam held up the license plate, which he secretly took from the back, since the front was buried in dirt. I believe that was given to Andre Hopkins. Never thought that he would be caught in all of this," Fabio added. "Sorry for disturbing you. I know this is a lot," Liam said. He left to go find Andre. Andre lived in a rundown part of the city. Liam knocked on the door. "Please, open up, Andre. I just want to talk," he said, knocking on the door. No answer. Liam knocked again. "Open the door," Liam shouted. Screw off," a voice shouted back. "Andre, I just want to talk," Liam said. "A Fourth Amendment," the voice replied. "Andre, no, we can do this the easy way or the hard way," Liam shouted. Suddenly, a large, overweight young man came to the door. His clothes were slightly tattered and covered in a red liquid. "What do you want?" he asked. "Andre, I just want to talk. Where were you when Emil Power's daughter and William Antonio's daughter were kidnapped and killed?" Liam asked. "I was driving around after drinking. I later picked up some folks and brought them to the forest for some bird watching," Andre had answered. "Who were the people you picked up and what was the forest like?" Liam had asked. "Oh, young kids, both girls had a fun time. Screamed on the way there, they were so happy," Andre answered. "And what were their names?" Liam asked. "Oh, some Italian name and a girl named Francine," Andre guessed. "Did you put them in the tree?" Liam asked. "Only for the bird watching. They wouldn't shut up about going home, so I beat them. Might have killed them," Andre answered. "Can I come in?" Liam asked. "Sure," Andre said. Liam entered the rundown apartment. There were beer bottles, magazines, and papers everywhere. He listened as Andre described his life. As Andre held up a gun, he pointed it at Liam. "You know, I just realized, your voice sounds funny. You ain't from around here, you're from out of the country. Folks like you deserve to go back to where they came from," Andre yelled. He fired the gun at Liam, but he missed. He then began to grab a beer bottle, but he was tackled by Liam. "Get your hands off me," Andre shouted. "Andre Hopkins, you're under arrest for the murders of Viviana Antonio and Francine Powers, along with attempting to assault a police detective," Liam said. He pushed the sloppily dressed man into the back of his car in handcuffs, and he delivered him to the station where Mr. E spat at him. After several hours of interrogation, Andre was housed in the holding cell, where he would then be transferred to a jail. After he was brought to a jail, he was finally brought to trial nearly 2 years later. My father told me all about the trial, but I fell asleep since it was so long and boring. Andre, according to my father, had pleaded not guilty by insanity, and the judge and even the jury weren't having it. He was sentenced to 100 years for what he had done, and given a death sentence for Viviana's. As he was let out, he shouted at Liam, Will, and Emil, calling them all horrible things. For years, Andre sat on death row, awaiting to meet his maker. But just 3 hours before he was scheduled to die by the chair, something came in. The federal government had abolished the death penalty. Andre, along with the other death row inmates across the country, had their sentences commuted to life in prison. Andre, being a dangerous offender, was given no chance of parole for 100 years. Funny, since that meant he wouldn't get out. Nope. Andre would get to experience the freedoms of other non-death row prisoners though, like shopping, seeing family, and other stuff. But one night, when my father was eating his dinner sandwich, he received word of something that would haunt him. Emil called him and said these words that made my father drop his sandwich, making it fall harder than Hannibal's elephants did when they fell trying to cross the mountains on their way to Rome. Andre Hopkins had just escaped, and prison officials let him go shopping for his good behavior, and he had just vanished like a ghost, Emil had said. Not by him being released from prison, but because he had escaped. Now he was on the run and lurking out in the shadows. Liam ran inside and panted, looking around his property in hopes to catch the deranged guy yet again. He had worked for weeks, even months on end, to get this psychopath monster behind bars so he wouldn't harm another hair on another soul. But now he was out there possibly looking for him. "Come on, where are ya?" he had muttered to himself. When he was angry, no one would dare cross his path. If they did, they'd feel the wrath of God and his army coming down upon them, like a heavy rainfall during a monsoon. He huffed and went back into the house and decided to go back to work. While working on the case of Andre's disappearance, he would hear strange noises from inside the house. Thinking that it was his kids or pets, he shook it off. But what he would hear would make him shudder. Something, or rather someone very familiar, was inside the walls, waiting to strike him at the perfect moment. After several years of Andre still on the run, Liam began the hunt for him. It was 1978 and Andre had been in prison for just over 12 years. Liam started working on some unsolved cases from El Paso in Texas. Around this time, I was only 20 and I had moved away, not knowing what my father did since I didn't read the local paper or see him too often, as he was always out working, even on holidays. Like a kid in a candy store, he never stopped. Liam was busy filling the cases, so he would focus on other ones. Even frustrated, he was now willing to give in. Most of the squad, including Mystery, had given up, and said that Andre likely had died in the forest or to someone who got him in the forest. After hours of working though, he went outside to get some sun. He didn't get much and the doctor recommended he did so he wouldn't become like Dracula at only 56. He was upset at this but soon realized that this would lead to more grisly findings. Emil would also step in to help. Mr. E, although not entirely for it, eventually let Emil help. He had had a change of heart since reading the works of Malcolm X and Martin Luther King. As Liam had walked along his back porch, he smelled something foul like a dead animal. He went to investigate and to track the smell, and the odor led him to a patch of bushes. When Liam had opened it, he gasped. There lay the body of a young boy who looked to be around 6 or 7. He had bruises on his left and his right arm was missing. Liam had found it in a stream nearby. Emil shouted to him that he had found the remains of another one in the woods, albeit a different tree than where his daughter was found in. Liam called his police friends and they arrived within the hour. Liam was questioned and the houses were quickly searched. "We'll have to go somewhere, a hotel maybe," Liam had asked. "Fine, I just hope that it's not for too long," his wife Maeve had answered. They packed some things for a hotel and let the police do their work. Liam would go back and help, and he would soon learn from the locals that more bodies had been found. Some were near the highway, others in the forest, and others near other houses. Only one of the family members of one of the victims came forward to help give a description of the killer, now dubbed the Texas Killer. Liam would get his hands on the sketch and notice some odd details. The way that it was drawn, it was similar to that of Andre. He was out there and he needed to be caught before he struck again. He drove for hours and hours on end, not finding a dang sight of Andre. It was until he got home when he had heard the noise. The police had done their research in the house and they left. Liam had grabbed a knife from the kitchen, ready to strike. "Who's there?" he asked. Nothing. Just silence in the darkness in front of him. Another creak came from inside the house. "Now you messing around, coward. Show yourself," he shouted. All of a sudden, with a loud thump, a man bolted at Liam, pounding him into the floor, and they began to shoot at him. "Andre, what the heck are you doing here?" Liam asked. "I might as well get my vengeance on you. Put me away and all. Got some balls for that." Maeve woke up and shrieked when she saw his face. Andre bolted at her, knocking her down and taking her out. Liam tried to fight back, but he was knocked near unconsciousness. Andre soon dragged Maeve into the bedroom. He then forced himself upon her as she cried. Liam was next to passing out. With all of his remaining strength, he called Emil and Will and told him to come to the house and to also call the police. Emil did so. He arrived with a shotgun and Will with a butcher's knife. "Get the heck away from her," Emil shouted. Andre ran past Emil and knocked the gun from his hands. He found one of Liam's pistols and grabbed it. He soon went to the neighbor's house and took their kid, and he came out with the gun aimed at his head. "Oh, come on, bring me back to prison. Do it, or this kid meets his maker," Andre shouted. Liam limped out, gun in hand. "Don't shoot to kill, shoot to injure. You hear that? I want this guy alive," Liam ordered as the police had arrived. "Please, sir, don't," the boy cried. "It doesn't need to be like this, Andre. Let him go," Liam begged. "What, so he can go back to his perfect family? No, I never had that chance. My father was a pig. No job and he drank. I wanted that old man gone, and I got my wish when he got the chair. I never had a happy life, so why should others?" Andre asked, tears steaming up. "Because not all families are perfect. No one is. Not even mine. Heck, I spend most of my time looking for you. I barely got to say hello to my own children," Liam had answered. "Yeah, well, that's still better than what God gave me. He screwed me over too many times. Now I repay the favor by doing the same to him. See how he likes it," Andre said. Liam lowered his pistol and placed his hands on his hips. Andre wasn't having it. He took out the boy. "No!" Emil shouted. Liam ran after Andre, who fled into the woods. He fired and so did Andre. It wasn't until Andre either lost his breath or he tripped over a branch when he was caught. Andre heavily resisted and had to be subdued, and he eventually was caught and arrested. At the separate trials, he pled not guilty to all of the counts, but he eventually was charged with all the ones that had gone on. In the end, he had received 9 death sentences, 3 life sentences, and 4 20-year sentences, and on top of that, 8 10-year and 6 5-year sentences. He smiled at the small sentences which were announced first, but when it came to life and death, he wailed into tears. However, some of his death sentences were commuted to life, making his death sentences only 5. He spent several years on death row denying his guilt. He would file for appeals several times, but would be denied every single one. The day came, April in 1997, and my father asked me to come. I obliged, being the decent son that I am. Andre's last meal was a cheeseburger, french fries, a Coke, and a chocolate milkshake, just like my father had had when he was out of meals. "Why did you choose to eat that?" Liam had asked. "Oh, it's simple. 'Cause you did," Andre answered, smiling an evil grin. "Why of all people me? Did you not see me? I was there at a meals when you were questioning. I was in the window. You had every chance to catch me but said no to it. So tell me, are you really the genius that you say you are? 'Cause you would have noticed me," Andre answered, smiling his evil smile. "Time to go, Hopkins," a guard said. Andre took his last shower and spoke with the priest. We weren't allowed to hear the words due to confidentiality and because he told us not to. My father, myself, and the victims' families, Emil and some of Andre's family, and Will and Anthony all gathered in the waiting room. As the curtains were drawn, Andre lay on the gurney, flat and motionless, completely drained of all emotion. "Andre Hopkins, you have been tried, convicted, and sentenced to death by the state of Texas for the murders of..." He began to list the names of the victims. I couldn't remember most, only some, like Taylor Pearl, Kendricks Henderson, and Faith Sylvia. "Do you have any last words?" the priest asked. I know that what I did was right. God told me to screw off, so I told him to do the same. Come to think, I am a sinner. I've caused pain for everyone, and I deserve to suffer because of it. I hope that I can go in peace, knowing that I'm no better than a street rat," Andre said, crying in conflicting tones. No one could really know if he was really sorry or if he was just faking it to get his death sentence commuted, so that he could escape and do what he did before. As the process began, his eyes rolled back and he lay stone cold and not moving, and he was pronounced dead at 7:15 p.m. The warden said this was one of the fastest executions, as they usually take up to hours. But after that, my father and I hugged. We left that godforsaken prison and headed back to civilization. My father went on to live until 2017, at the old age of 96. Emil lived until he was 92 in 2019, and Will only made it until he was 87, as he died about a decade or so after Andre did. Anthony, Emil's son Henry, and I live relatively close to one another, and we're all friends. Since then, I haven't talked about Andre to anyone. I prefer to keep that memory locked away from when my kids get older. Maybe it's best if I never tell them. Today's episode is sponsored by Rocket Money. In today's day and age, we have so many subscriptions that it's hard to keep up with them all. Whether it be for food, TV, music, and so on, the list just continues to go on and on. Thankfully for Rocket Money, they make managing all of my subscriptions super easy. Just this week, a few of the prices on my subscriptions went up unexpectedly, and without Rocket Money, I wouldn't have been alerted and then been able to cancel them. Rocket Money is a personal finance app that finds and cancels your unwanted subscriptions, monitors your spending, and helps lower your bills so that you can grow your savings. Rocket Money has over 5 million users and has saved a total of 500 million in canceled subscriptions, saving members up to $740 a year when using all of the app's features. Stop wasting money on things that you don't use. Cancel your unwanted subscriptions by going to rocketmoney.com/MrCreeps. That's rocketmoney.com/MrCreeps. rocketmoney.com/MrCreeps. Vacant. It's the word I would use to describe myself. Ever since that mind-boggling experiment, I haven't been myself. It's been 3 years since the experiment took place. I used the $2 million to move into a cabin in Alaska to get away from my past and attempt to forget about who I was and the experiences that led me here. I spent these last 3 years hunting and living off the land. You may be asking how there's a second part to this. Well, let's just say that God, the universe, or whatever controls this stuff really wants to screw me over. I was on a hunting trip, and when I was tracking, I slipped and fell down a small cliff. I ended up fracturing my ankle. Safe, safe, safe. You killed us. It's your fault. You killed us. You watched us all die. I didn't kill anyone, I yelled. I didn't know where I was, but I remember seeing a doctor. I panicked and I lunged at him. I then proceeded to attack him, and I kept screaming, "You did this. You killed them." A couple of doctors tranked me, and I woke up in prison. So I was arrested for attempted murder. 2 weeks went by till I was called out of my cell. "Dr. Aaron Roca, there are men here that want to talk to you." As I walked to the booth, I recognized the man waiting to talk to me. It was the guy who drugged me into this, the man who led the first experiment. "Hello, Aaron. Well, it seems like you got yourself into some trouble now. Well, look, I can help you out." "Look, you sicko. I don't want anything to do with you and your sick experiments." "Well, I guess you're just gonna rot in prison until the end of your days then." He proceeded to get up and walk away. Instinctively, I yelled out, "Stop." I had no idea what was going through my head, but in a moment of desperation, I had made my decision. "I presume that you've changed your mind. How exactly can you help me out?" "Well, you see, we've liked your work so much in your last experiment that we wanted to bail you out. Of course, only if you agree with our terms. And those are: we have a new research chemical that we want to test. S-180, aka the God Serum. Look, as long as no test patients are harmed and no children are involved, I'll comply." "Look, I promise that no children will be involved this time, but I can't promise that no patients will be harmed. To compensate, we'll use death row inmates as the test patients. Does that sound good to you?" "Yeah." "Okay then, well, let's get you out of here. The file explaining the goal of this project should be arriving to your house in about 2 weeks." Looking back at it, I wish I would have just rotted away in that jail cell. Like the director of this project said, no later than 2 weeks, and the file was in my mailbox. Page 1 described what this substance was made out of. This serum is mostly psychoactive, but there was also going to be physical changes from what I've read. And that's where I come in as the geneticist. Page 2 describes the meaning of God Serum. It was given that name because of its tendency to make ordinary people believe that there's some type of God, giving them a God complex. Page 3 describes the physical changes that possibly could take place, like changes in skin tone. Once again, I found myself flying over Texas skies soon to arrive in San Antonio. Once I arrived in San Antonio, I was sent into an immediate panic attack. Instant thoughts started to flood my mind. I started to remember what I had witnessed. I collapsed. I then woke up in that godforsaken research facility. "Welcome to the San Antonio Research Facility. It's nice to see you again, Aaron," the director said. I was on the verge of passing out again, but I found the smallest bit of composure to regain my stability. "Hey, look, don't smile at me like you're some type of good guy. I know what you sociopaths like to do for your so-called research purposes." "Oh, look, Aaron, I don't have time to play around with you. You're going to do your job and we can both leave here happy. Okay? Well, I think you understand." He walked me through the facility, leading me into the laboratory. Suddenly, through the corner of my eye, I saw the same doctor that had performed the last experiment with me. "Let me guess, you got blackmailed into this too." "Well, you know, I just haven't been the same ever since that last experiment. And let's just say that I've obtained a bit of a drinking problem that led to bigger issues. That's why I'm here." "Oh, sorry to interrupt, but I need both of you to start getting ready to start the experiment," the director said. "Alright, listen up. You all aren't rookies, so don't make rookie mistakes. Aaron, all you have to do as of right now is to take notes. Robert, you will monitor the brain activity of the patients. And last but not least, Jessica, you will inject the serum and will coordinate the pace of this experiment, the director said. What will happen to the test patient? Robert interrupted. Well, I was about to get there before you rudely interrupted me. The goal of this project is to test out S-180, aka the God Serum. This serum is predicted to induce mostly psychoactive changes, but physical changes will take place as well. Hey, look man, what is the goal of this project, other than injecting some BS into test patients? Robert asked again. Look kid, you don't get paid for answers, you get paid for your work. Now everyone get ready, we'll be starting shortly, the director said. Nerves started to rush through my veins. Jessica then calls the patients into the room to begin injecting the serum. Also, I forgot to mention who these test patients were. The first patient's name was Oliver. He was sentenced to death row for capital murder. The second was Mac, sentenced to death row for hacking government databases. And finally, the third patient, Jane, sentenced to death because she was convicted of mass murder. 14 if I can remember correctly. So knowing this information about them made me feel a little bit better participating in this experiment that I knew wasn't going to end well. Alright everyone, set the timer, this experiment is now underway. Hour 1. Nothing odd was observed other than a bunch of sociopaths giving each other death stares. Hour 2. The test patients started to talk amongst themselves about why they had gotten sentenced. So, why are you here, cutie? Max said. Well, let's just say I got carried away quite a few times, Jane replied. If any of you say another word, I will happily make y'all my last victims, Oliver said. Whoa, hey man, I mean, we're all crazy, but I think we can be relatively normal for a bit. Well, at least until this experiment ends, Max said. Until the experiment ends? You really aren't clueless. What part of death row inmates and experiments go well together? Look man, just don't make these last few hours of my life miserable. Please, just shut up. Hour 3. This is when things started to take a turn. Guys, come check this out, Jessica said. Right before my eyes, I was seeing a neurogenesis take place at a rapid rate. Although a massive spike in neural activity was taking place, nothing seemed even a bit off from the test patients. Hour 4. Suddenly, out of the blue, the most unexpected things happened. These what I thought to be mentally deranged people were actually apologizing for their faults. They started to look up to the ceiling. Maybe they saw something that we couldn't, but they were quite literally being judged either by themselves or something external. Hour 5. This is when I started to notice physical changes. All of the test patients' temperatures were normal up until this hour, but suddenly, all of their temperatures spiked to 110. Other than this, the test patients remained quiet throughout this hour. Hour 6. Hour 6 mostly consisted of Oliver crying uncontrollably until he ran out of tears. Why, no, this is nothing like me. Hour 7. Jane started to behave in a very unusual way. First, it started off by her gagging, and then she started to walk on all fours, consistently repeating, I'm an animal. I will always be an animal. I don't deserve to be a human. Hour 8. It was pretty much a continuation of Hour 7. You may be asking, what was Oliver doing this entire time? Well, Oliver stayed dead silent in the corner, staring deep into the wall, not even once turning away. Hour 9. Mac finally broke his silence. We deserve this by all means. We become the bottom of the pit. Let us feel the wrath of God. Mac then goes on to leap in an unnatural way straight to Jane, and then proceeded to attack her while saying, You are a sinner. You are no better than the pigs who bathe in crap. Hour 10. Mac had beat Jane senseless, leaving her dead within 30 minutes. Oliver, throughout this whole time, stayed weeping on the ground, Okay, I think that's enough for now, Max said. Mac, is it possible that even I can be cleansed? Oliver asked. Good question, but no. None of us will be forgiven for what we've done. But I won't let us go out without experiencing just a fraction of the pain that we've caused, Mac replied. Then why haven't you killed me? Do it. End my suffering. I can't take this anymore. Because you're going to kill me. How about you end my suffering? Max said. I'm scared, Mac. Is it possible that you can comfort me before the end as my last wish? I beg you. Max stayed quiet, and then again, he sat down in the corner, fixating his attention at the wall. Hour 11. This is when the biggest physical change took place. Oliver and Mac's skin started to turn light blue. You could see their veins and arteries. Why was this happening? I have no idea. But slowly, I started to understand. Oh, so it's finally coming close to an end, the director said. What the heck is happening to his skin? Matter of fact, what is the research chemical made out of? I won't go into detail just yet, but answering your first question, the reason their skin is turning orange is by the small amounts of extraterrestrial DNA. I had so many questions, but of course, I had to wait until after the experiment for them to explain. Hour 12. Mac quickly gets up and runs at an inhuman level of speed towards the wall over and over again. Oliver quickly joins in. I'm assuming they had had enough of this experiment and decided that it was time to take themselves out. But of course, this egotistical director wasn't satisfied, so he quickly ordered guards to tranquilize the two men and strap them down in chairs. I can't take this anymore, please, Max said. Freaking do it, get rid of us. I will give you both a quick death if you explain in full detail the reasoning behind these actions, the director asked. Around us exist dimensions, and well, the entity who runs it all. I've seen him and he's spoken to me, Oliver said. Oliver, don't you say another word, Max spoke. Or what? I want to die already, don't you? Of course I do, but still. You know what waits for us on the other side, right? The director pulls out his handgun and completely unloads the clip into Mac's head. Okay, now that we've got that situated, continue please, the director said. Yeah, well, back to what I was saying. Around us exist dimensions that we cannot see with the naked eye. But once you injected us with whatever that was, we entered this realm. Explain to us what this realm is like. Well, it was quite colorful, strange, and outright unearthly. For example, there were shapes and colors that I've never seen before, entities roaming around in the abyss. And don't get me started on these strange vibrational sounds that I heard. This sounds like a lot like DMT to me, I said. What exactly is DMT, Aaron? The director said. Well, DMT is a naturally occurring chemical in our bodies that is theorized to help us dream at night. And while you can find a pure substance of it and smoke it and experience a trip-like state. I know this from experience, just like on the last experiment. I knew what LSD was like, and now I can clearly see that the guys have decided to modify DMT as well. You catch on quick, Aaron. I'm impressed, but right now isn't the time for that. Explain in broader detail. What else do you want to know? 1 minute I was here in this room and the next, I was launched into a different dimension. Is this really my existence? Is this really how it's all going to end? Oliver started to enter a psychosis-like state. I couldn't say that I didn't feel bad for him, but at the end of the day, he was still a murderer. We all wear a mask. We are all truly insane. We are all insane. You, me, and everyone here. No one in this world truly knows each other. We all hold up a mask and hide our true nature. We are truly lost and alone. Well, is this your true nature? The director asked. I remember now, who I was before my mask was put on. Can you answer my question? No, I remember who I truly was before all of this chaos. Now I'm gonna need you to give me a better idea about what you're talking about. Whatever your name is, do you remember who you were before the mask? Well, maybe if you gave a better explanation of what you were talking about, I would give a proper response. Ego is the word. Well, hear me out before the mask. What I mean before the ego, when we were children, we were so innocent. There was no fear of death, no fear of status, no fear of anything. The present moment was all we had. The sky was still a bright blue. Look, don't get all philosophical on me. I know what it was like to be a kid, but give me more information about these so-called masks. We slowly became more and more conscious about the horrors of this world, and slowly our innocence started to fade. Life was no longer life anymore, but merely a competition of status. Why do you think children are so precious to everyone? Because they have not yet acquired a mask. But we all know that they too will grow up to know the terrors of this world. I know I wasn't a murderer before, but ego, the mask, can lead you down dark valleys. To my old self, my true self, I truly apologize that I ended up here. Alright, thank you for explaining. You have now earned the privilege of death. I was completely terrified, not of anything visually, but of the words that he spoke. The truth, the light had seeped through my mask. I really started to question myself as well. Who was I before the mask? He's really got you thinking, huh? The director spoke. Yeah, I'm not going to lie, his words did send a shiver down my spine. Well, Aaron, just finish examining their bodies and after head to my office so we can have a little chat. For some reason, their skin turned a very bright blue, but I was confused. If this was DMT, there shouldn't have been any physical changes. But other than the strange skin, there wasn't much of a difference between them now and before the experiment. So, you called me here to talk to you? Well, yes, I would like to thank you for helping us out. Even though these two past experiments don't relate to your work, having you here really does make things run smoother. Look, I'm not gonna act like I'm here by choice, but I feel like I deserve an explanation. Why? Why use children in the last experiment, and why keep on murdering for so-called research purposes? You see, you have become very arrogant, and that's a good thing. The public has been brainwashed into believing that there is a structure, that there are morals. Y'all have been focused on stupid beliefs and external factors, that you have all forgotten that we are human too. We are curious too, and we have goals. We have curiosities, and most importantly, we have power. Why would you tell me all of this? Well, that's why I called you here. You have two choices. Either you stay here and keep on doing experiments until the end of your days, or I simply kill you. I'm sorry that it has to be like this, but you know too much. I will continue to support your research experiments, sir. I only complied to buy time. Right now, I sit in my room writing this to y'all. I'm messed up in the head and I'm in too deep. There's no way I'm going to keep doing experiments, and I'm not going to let that guy kill me. So after this is posted, I will take my last breath in this hellish reality. Be safe and remember, nothing good lurks in the shadows, and if it's possible, try to find the light in this world. This is Aaron Roca signing off. I inherited a 500-acre ranch along with 250 head of cattle out in West Texas. My great-grandfather passed it down the line until it eventually ended up in my hands, and it was his pride and joy. Growing up, he told stories of the cowboys who rode out west, settling land and setting up homes for their families. I was always awestruck at the surreal descriptions of their day-to-day lives, and how the rugged cowpokes and the horses they rode upon were able to keep towns fed, and their eventual start of rodeos and riding competitions that are still held today. Originally, my father was left with it after my grandfather had passed. He moved us into it when I was still young, along with my mother and my sisters, Allison and Angela. It was your typical ranch lifestyle growing up. My father would walk into my room at 4:30 in the morning, waking me up to go help him feed the cattle and chickens, along with the other animals we had at the time. My 2 younger sisters eventually were brought into the loop when they were a little bit older, but were always treated like princesses. But when I failed a simple task like cleaning out the barn, there would be severe repercussions, ranging from a beating with a belt to not getting dinner. But my sisters would always sneak me some food, and my mother would always try to justify why I would be the only one receiving the harsh punishment. I guess looking back on it now, I understand why he was being so hard on me. We had a few extra ranch hands that helped keep everything running. I remember one of my favorite people to work with was this older gray-haired man called Pete. He had a thick, handlebar mustache and looked like your typical cowboy. He would always have a cigarette between his lips, and told stories about the natives that lived here long before us, and the spirits that supposedly haunted the land. My father didn't like it due to the fact that I would always have nightmares after, but the stories were what I always looked forward to when I got out of school and I had finished my chores. I never really experienced any paranormal events. The only thing that I had witnessed that truly left me in complete awe was when my father and I found a mutilated heifer that was torn completely in half. It was strung up in one of the trees out in the pasture. It wasn't uncommon to find a dead cow or two, but the way that it was strung up in the tree, it defied all logical explanation. My father was prepping me to run the ranch as I grew older, but teenage me had different plans at the time. I had enlisted in the military my senior year of high school, and this pissed my father off so bad that he told me not to bother coming back once I had graduated boot camp. They were harsh words, but I was used to it. When writing home, I'd always get letters back from my mother who would give every detail on what happened that day, or what was going on in town, and it always kept me in high spirits. Before the sad events of 9/11, nothing too serious was going on in the world, and the unit I was in cleaned rifles in parking lots for the majority of the time. I remember receiving a phone call from my father the day that it happened. "Son, you stay safe and come back in one piece." That was the only call I had received from him for the next couple of years. I had done a few tours over in the Middle East and Afghanistan before I decided to get out. In that period of time, I got married to my lovely wife Kate and had 2 kids of my own, 2 daughters, Madison and Kimberly. They grew up with their mother for the most part. It was a strained relationship thanks to the constant moving and the fact that I would be gone for 6 months at a time. She was left to care for them while I was gone, but we managed to make it work. She was ecstatic about the news that I was leaving the military. It was around that time I was told about my father, who was fighting stage 3 lung cancer. I packed the family up, leaving North Carolina, and I headed down to Texas. We spent the remaining hours of my father's life by his side. We talked about the crazy experiences that we had been through, and how being a parent was one of the hardest things in life. When I was the last one in the room with him, he told me something that I didn't completely understand until now. "Son, the ranch is a huge responsibility, and everything you have experienced in life has led up to you taking care of it. Whatever you do, don't leave it, no matter what happens, Chris. Promise me that." He spoke as tears swelled in his eyes. "I promise." I held his hand. His grip was weak. It was no longer the strong and calloused hands that he had worked hard with. He eventually passed, leaving behind the ranch in his will. This will stated the ranch and its assets would go to the eldest child of the family, and that happened to be me. My younger sisters didn't care much. They had moved to different states and had families of their own, and they were doing quite well. Everyone came down to the ranch after my father's funeral. It was a typical Texan wake. There were tons of alcohol and barbecue passed around that night, in honor of the hard man that was my father, before leaving back to their homes. My sisters were the last to leave, and they said their goodbyes, leaving my family alone on the 500 acres of open Texas plains. That was 12 years ago. The ranch itself consisted of a 2-story house and a small living area for a few ranch hands on the eastern side of the property, as well as a large barn and a few chicken coops, and a horse stable on the south side of the house. The rest was just open, arid plains filled with plenty of wildlife. I spent most of the day tending to the livestock and helping out with the repairs to the horse stable. Something had torn a few of the thick metal bars on one of the stalls from its housing. One of the ranch hands said that it was some kind of dog that had done it, but I brushed it off as some wise-ass telling ghost stories to the new guys. Or one of the hands was baked when he was doing the rounds and had slammed into it with something. "Take care, boss." One of the ranch hands gave me a quick wave as he headed towards the beat-up fort, with the rest of the ranch hands. "I'll see you all in the morning. Eat a large breakfast, we have a lot to do." I yelled towards the group. They had just gotten paid and were probably going to spend their allowance at a bar or some casino up in Oklahoma. My 2 dogs, Maxim, a tan lab mix, and Zeus, a spotted border collie, ran around trying to round up a few cattle that had strayed too far from their herd, as I took off my worn work gloves, setting them on the hood of my old truck. "Maxim, Zeus, let's load up." The dogs came running over, jumping into the bed of the truck. After a few minutes of driving, I pulled up to the house. After putting the dogs up, I headed inside. Kate was making supper to a country tune. "How's work?" she asked, dancing over to me. "Good, I had to fix up the horse stable." She spun back around, dancing back to the stove. "Where are the kids?" I asked, noticing the lack of complaints about not having good cell service. "Oh, they're still cleaning out the barns and chicken coop." "Honey, wake up. There's something in the barn." My wife shook me violently, waking me from a deep sleep. What? I blinked a few times, trying to wake up. Her red hair was a mess. "There's something in the barn," she hissed, clutching my wrist with a death grip. I quickly got dressed, pulling on a jacket and my old pair of work boots. I walked over to the closet, grabbing my father's lever-action 30-30, along with a flashlight. "I'll go check it out. Stay inside." My watch showed that it was 3:26 a.m. as I made my way down the hall. "Dad, what was that?" Madison stuck her head out of the room, with a pair of headphones dangling from her neck. "Go back in your room," I replied, just as Kimberly exited her room. "I'm scared." Her voice trembled as she walked out into the hallway. "Go to your mother's room," I responded quickly. They both ran into the room, talking in hushed tones, as I continued down the hallway towards the stairs. Maxim and Zeus were going berserk. They were barking and straining hard against their chains, trying to get to the barn. The animals we had near the house were also in a panic state. I clicked on the flashlight, Its dull orange glow illuminated the dirt path leading towards the barn. What little remains from a few dead chickens lay in front of the barn. Feathers and blood were soaking into the ground. Something had pulled the door open, breaking the latch, securing it shut. I raised my rifle slowly, entering the doorway. Inside were stalls lining each side of the walls running to the back of the barn. Inside were a few dairy cows that I had bought a few weeks earlier. Their distraught cries filled the barn as I made my way towards the back. As I got closer, I noticed a blood trail leading to one of the stalls. With a steady hand, I pulled the stall door open, revealing a wounded dairy cow. She had a large gash running from her third hind quarter to the middle of her sternum. Her entrails hung out as she lay breathing heavily, in great distress as blood began to pool around her body. I knelt down beside her, resting my rifle on the stall wall, placing my hand on her head. "What did this to you, girl?" I spoke quietly. Something slammed the door shut behind me, causing me to damn near jump. I scooped up my rifle and I aimed it at the door. "If you're out there, make yourself known, or you're going to get shot," I yelled, trying to keep my composure. There was no response. I flipped the latch and swung the door open, sweeping the area for any potential threats, but only found a set of footprints in the dirt-covered floor leading back to the entrance. They looked canine in nature, but were too large to be any dog or coyote that I've ever seen. I ran back into the house, slamming the door shut and locking it. "Honey, call the sheriff." I quickly made my way back to the bedroom. Kate had her phone in hand and was talking to a dispatcher. "Something broke into our barn. Yes, please send a deputy out as soon as possible." I grabbed my truck keys and cell phone. "I'll be back. Don't let anyone inside." I grabbed the Glock 19 that I kept on the nightstand and handed it to her. "What's this for?" she asked, confused. "Honey, something got one of the dairy cows and I think it's going to get more." They were really scared now. "Don't leave," Kimberly cried. "Listen, you shoot anyone that's not me or the sheriff. Don't leave the house. Lock all of the doors and windows." I gave Kate a quick kiss and I headed back to the living room. I took Maxim and Zeus off their chains and led them to my truck, opening the passenger door, letting them in the cab. I slid into the driver's seat and I started the truck. Its large V8 engine shook the cab as it idled in the cold December air. I put the truck in drive and headed out towards the pasture to check on the livestock closest to the farmstead. After driving for a few minutes, my phone rang. It was Kate. "The sheriff is on his way over. What do you want me to tell you when he gets here?" Her voice was tense. I thought for a moment before answering. "Tell him to meet me near the fishing pond we drink at. It's the one on the western side of the pasture. He knows what I'm talking about." There was a small moment of silence. "All right, please be careful." And then she hung up the phone. The only sounds in the truck now were coming from the two panting dogs and the low hum from the radio. After a few more minutes of driving, I arrived at the fishing pond. A large cluster of oak trees were lined near the bank of the opposite side. The headlights from my truck illuminated a small herd of cattle bunched up near the bank of the pond. They were all letting out distress calls as they began to move towards my direction. The hackles on Zeus and Maxim's necks were sticking up. Both of them were emitting deep, guttural growls. Their eyes were focused on something off in the distance. I followed their gaze, but I couldn't see what they were seeing. I exited the truck, leaving the dogs inside with the windows cracked cautiously, making my way towards the bank. The herd was walking around me when I spotted it. Two large yellow eyes piercing through the darkness at me. I glanced at one of the cattle scurrying by for a split second. It had a large chunk missing from its right flank, and a large, jagged claw mark running down its ribcage. The dogs were barking wildly in the truck now, as the cattle began to run in a panic. I could hear the sound of heavy footsteps getting closer and closer as I began to backpedal towards the truck. I could barely make the outline of it as it closed the distance on all fours. Adrenaline was burning through my veins as I raised my rifle and started firing at it. Time seemed to speed up as I cranked the lever, feeding in a new round after every shot. Why the hell did I bring a lever-action rifle? I cursed myself for not bringing my AR as I ripped the driver's side door open trying to get in. Before I was able to get a foot in the door, Zeus and Maxim jumped out, hitting the ground running at full speed towards the creature. "Get back here!" I yelled to no effect as they circled the monster. It was in full view now, its figure illuminated by the headlights of my truck. It looked like a massive humanoid dog on 2 feet, with large, sharp claws. The creature swung at Maxim and Zeus, trying to get them to back off. Huge plumes of smoke came from its mouth and nostrils, with each swing, but they didn't budge. Zeus latched onto its hind leg, causing it to let out a deep cry. It swung again at Zeus, sending him tumbling off into the brush, and this only pissed off Maxim. Maxim latched onto its left bicep, shaking his head like a deadly game of tug-of-war. I continued firing into the creature's chest before he swung Maxim into my lane of fire. I immediately stopped firing, fearing that I would shoot my dog. And that's when I saw the flashing red and blue neon lights from a sheriff's vehicle bouncing off of the treetops. The creature swung at Maxim, hitting him on the side. This caused Maxim to yelp and release the creature's arm. "What in God's name?" the sheriff said, awestruck by the scene. "Shoot it!" I began firing again. One of my rounds hit it in the eye, causing it to stumble backwards. The sheriff began firing on it now, but it seemed to make little difference as the creature got down on all fours and ran back into the darkness. When I got called out here, I wasn't expecting this. He let out a breath. A few hours later, a black SUV pulled up and 2 men wearing black suits asked me a series of questions regarding the event. "Are you sure it wasn't a coyote? Have you been drinking this evening? Are you sure it wasn't a pack of feral hogs?" I had the same response to all of their questions. No. They went on for another 2 hours before they finally questioned my wife and kids along with the sheriff. They took the only copy of the dash cam footage from the sheriff's truck and eventually left. A helicopter flew over the house out towards the pasture with a huge spotlight on it, circling the area for a few minutes before leaving. We sat at the dining table near the kitchen, talking about what had transpired in the past few hours. None of us could believe it. I've never seen anything like that before in my life. The sheriff exhaled as he took his cowboy hat off, placing it on the table. Neither have I. Whatever that thing was, it's still out there, I responded, looking out the window towards the moonlit pastures. In case you were wondering, Zeus and Maxim are doing fine. They were a little banged up, but after a few days, they were back in the job rounding up cattle like nothing had happened. I hired a few more ranch hands to do nightly inspections around the pasture to make sure the cattle weren't being harmed, and so far it had been working. The guys were also telling me about seeing strange lights hovering over the property. I don't even want to think about what that could entail. As of now, everything has gone back to normal. I just hope it'll stay that way. I grew up in an area of rural East Texas dominated by a large river and an ancient primal forest. This area would often flood, usually about once or twice a year, leaving people particularly isolated for several days to a week. Everyone out there has their stories. You practically can't spend more than a month out there without something strange happening. I spent the first 16 years of my life out there, and the things that I experienced caused so many problems for me. Problems that I'm only recently getting over. I obsessed over these events, wound up with a lifelong interest in the occult, probably from studying paranormal events as a way to build a mental framework to understand everything that happened out there. Things are better now. I finally accepted that I'll never understand, that these questions will never be answered. The land itself was heavily forested, as I mentioned above. The actual layout was river bottoms and hills. Most houses were built on top of the hills because of the annual flooding. This will have to be a series. I have stories not only of my 16 years there, but from my mother, father, older brother, friends, and other family members. The first story that I would like to tell started before I was born. I used to know the exact date, but a house fire took my original notes about 10 years ago. My mother, father, and older brother, who would have been very young at the time, were home during a flood. Our house was on the top of a hill next to my grandparents' house and my aunt's house. During the floods, we would all just hang out together and wait for the waters to recede. This usually took between 3 to 7 days. Typically, the power would go out after a day or so. All the households over there had boats, canoes, kayaks, little fishing boats. Living out there at the flooding, rivers and creeks made boat ownership necessary. So during this flood, on one of the early nights, my family were visited by a neighbor who had boated over, a 40-something woman from down the road, highly religious, from one of the more extreme sectors of either Southern Baptist or Pentecostal that were common out there. No drinking, no swearing, no dancing, etc. This woman barged into our house demanding to know where the booze was kept, calling my parents filthy names. They offered her some of my dad's beer, but she didn't want it, opting instead to chug the bottle of rubbing alcohol from the bathroom before leaving. My family figured she had had a psychotic break. Her next-door neighbor found her after the waters had dropped. She was dead in her house, apparently ripped apart by some animal. No one really mentions her out there. She had no family, no real friends out there. I found out more when I was a teenager and I interviewed her neighbor. He was a school friend's uncle. My friend actually lived in the woman's old house at that point, and he wasn't all there. I only mention this because he lacked the intelligence and imagination to make up the things that he told me. He said that while the woman was ripped apart, chewed, clawed to pieces, there were things written in her blood all over the walls. He showed me some stuff that he had copied down. Strange symbols and veves, but nothing matching anything that I've seen since. After all these years, I truly believe it was nonsense, just gibberish. I wish that I had something more concrete, an answer, that I could point and say there were symbols from this system or beliefs denoting this specific usage or meaning. But unfortunately, nothing added up. That man died a few months after telling me this. Nothing mysterious or sinister, just a stupid accident. He set fire to himself in his house, smoking while cleaning engine parts and gasoline. Almost killed my friend too. His stores of ammunition caught fire and began going off like fireworks. About a year after that dim-witted neighbor had died, his niece had contacted me. She was a year younger than me, and one day she tells me that her brother is getting out of prison and moving in with them. He had been in for a non-violent robbery, a snatch and grabs basically. He was about 18 or 19, I believe. She calls me one day and says my brother wants to speak to me. I agree and he comes over. He starts asking me all sorts of questions about the occult and about the thing in the woods. And the majority of the upcoming stories will be about those woods. I tell him some of my pet theories that I was holding at the time, and he asked to see some of my books. So I loan him a couple. A few weeks later, he's dead. He had been paid to kidnap somebody's grandmother and kill her for insurance money, The cops had located the car before he did anything, and he killed himself rather than go to prison. The woman that he kidnapped swore up and down that he wasn't really going to hurt her, that he was roped into it and trying to find a place to hide her. I know this sounds unrelated, but after the funeral and life returning somewhat to normal, my friend, she confessed to me why her brother wanted to talk to the weird kid down the road with the obsession with paranormal stuff. She said that he had been seeing shadows in the woods out of his window, and he had heard things whispering to him. Some of the sketches in his journal looked like the same types of symbols that their uncle had shown me. I'll post more stories about the area tomorrow. This next story happened when I was probably about 9 or 10. The hilltop my house was on had 4 houses, one a little down one side that had some oddball neighbors. They'll figure in at some later story. My house, my grandfather's house, and my aunt's house. My aunt's spouse had kids from a previous marriage, one of whom was close to my age and my best friend growing up. The 3 family plots of land took up about 100 acres of land. Only a small amount was cleared. The majority of it was the forest. Past our houses in the backyards, the hill would dip down. There were a few lakes and then a sharp cliff with a creek at the bottom that marked the beginning of the forest. Since the land was so large, my dad had bought a golf cart to help with yard work, and I always enjoyed driving it around the land, through the trails and roads on the edges of the forest and between the houses. One day the family went out to some function and I decided to stay at home. My parents had already split up, so Dad was gone. My grandfather, my aunt, her partner, and my mother had all gone off to the function. The reason I stayed was my aunt's adopted son, C, was coming home that day. He had been off visiting his father and I hadn't seen him for a couple weeks. I figured I would goof around alone for a while, and then play with my friend when he got back. I got bored with Nintendo, and so I grabbed my cassette player and hopped on the golf cart and started driving around the yard and trails. The trails towards the cliff were dark and under a canopy of trees. You could just make the shape of the start of the real forest through them and past the cliff. I followed them around to the front yards past my aunt's house, where the cleared land stopped and rejoined a tributary along the edge of the woods, and I thought that I heard somebody calling my name. I paused the tape and listened, and eventually I heard it again. It sounded almost like a whisper, but from far off, strangely carrying more than a real whisper would. I took the headphones completely off and listened again and began looking around and heard nothing. I was about to drive off when I saw something in the tree line, right at the edge of the clearing. It looked like a person, tall and thin, but made entirely out of shadow. It was standing upright, though not against the ground or a tree, but a freestanding, vaguely human-shaped shadow. As young as I was, I grew up out of there and was fairly bright for a kid. I read constantly and I knew that human brains try to pick out familiar shapes out of jumbles, but I kept staring at it, and that's when it started moving. Always facing me, but moving towards the edge of the fence, where it broke from a rotted post. I floored the cart and drove up the hill to my aunt's house, and that's where things took a turn. My aunt's house was one story but had a sharply steeped roof, giving it a tall attic. There was a large vent in the attic a few feet above the back door. At one point it was either wooden or metal slats, but that vent had fallen off years earlier and been replaced with a tarp. I quickly got out to the top of the hill in the clearing of my aunt's yard, close to the back door. I heard a quick rustling sound and looked towards it. The attic. The tarp had partially come undone and was hanging down, exposing most of the vent hole. I'm guessing about 5 foot by 5 foot, maybe a bit smaller. Standing in the attic in the sunlight from the hole was a terrifying figure, something that I'll never forget. It was nude, somewhere between 5.5 feet to 6 feet tall, and staring down into the yard at me. My heart leaped into my throat and I was frozen. It wasn't just that there was a stranger in my aunt's attic or even the nudity. It was that it looked like a layer of its skin had been removed, either scrubbed or bleached off. No muscle tissue was exposed, but what looked like exposed fat and a texture and coloring that I believe were veins were clearly visible. The eyes stood out the most, The eyelids were completely gone, leaving this horrifying expression on the thing's face. We stared at each other for a few moments and then the thing turned and vanished. Not literally, just turned and went back into the attic past the view that the angle in the sunlight had granted. The realization that it could be going down into the house and out the door broke my paralysis, and I hit the gas and drove back to my house at top speed. Probably only about 25 to 30 miles per hour, honestly. I ran inside and I locked the doors. My family kept guns in the house. My dad had been gone a while, but some of his were still left behind. I grabbed my mother's snub-nosed .38 out of her closet and my dad's shotgun, and I waited in the kitchen near the phone and the window facing the road, waiting for Aaron's dad's car to go past. I must have waited over an hour staring out the window, looking immediately towards the slightest sound. Eventually, I saw the car drive past and turn down their driveway. I immediately started calling over and over again until my friend had picked up the phone. I immediately began shouting at him to go out the back door and run to my house. The front door was next to the hallway that led to the bathroom where the attic entrance was. I wanted him to get as far away from it as possible. Aaron seemed confused and said that he would be right over. And then I heard a loud banging sound over the phone and the sound of Aaron screaming. I heard the phone clatter and a few moments later, I could see him running up the path between our houses as fast as he could. I let him into the house and he told me that while he was on the phone with me, he heard the sound of the attic door banging open and somebody unfolding the ladder. This was a double fold. Gravity alone wouldn't cause that. He said that before he was able to get to the back, he could hear something coming down the stairs. That's all for tonight, everyone. I'll post again tomorrow evening. It appears that one of my friends from that time period is reading up on here. This next story actually involved the both of us. This next story takes place a few years later, probably around spring of 2001. I had moved out of state for a few years and had only recently moved back. I wasn't living out in the country again, but in a nearby small town only a short distance away. My friend Brad and I decided to start up our old investigative team again for old time's sake. And we were both getting older, both divorced but still pretty young. I guess we were trying to be kids together for a while. There's another tiny community close to the one that we grew up in that is somewhat famous for the ghost lights seen often. The town's name is Saratoga, and the road is called Bragg Road, and formerly known as the Ghost Light Road. Saratoga has a very small population, and at the time only a couple stores, a general store, a gas station, and a feed store, and a few small churches. Aside from that, it borders on protective forest preservations and backwoods oil fields. The town is right on the edge of a giant glob of a big thicket. Bragg Road itself connects two small highways. It's unpaved dirt and goes for a little over 7 miles. The local legend is that a train hand was beheaded and is walking about the now removed train tracks looking for his severed head. The light that you see is his lantern. Nobody who's seen the lights or studied them believe this. For one, the lights look nothing like a lantern light. They are groups of spherical lights ranging from about 2 to 7 feet across, usually pale yellow, green, blue, or red. They float about sometimes in formations, sometimes more scattered and gently bob and change direction. They have been observed to react to sound, particularly when people shout at them. I've noticed that myself on a much earlier trip. Brad and I met at his apartment and headed out fairly early. We swapped stories that we had both heard, reminisced about past adventures in Saratoga and other places, and joked. We had a little mini cassette recorder, Diane, with us, a couple cameras, and that was about it. One of the stories that we were discussing was about my neighbors growing up. These complete rednecks that lived halfway down my family's hill. They had told us the lights chased them until they were towards the end of the road. The man then got out to piss, came back covered in blood and cuts, and told his wife that the light had touched him and had caused the cuts. They were two crazy, drug-addled alcoholics, but I had heard more stories from more reputable people about the lights causing cuts and burns when touched, so I always wondered if maybe that was correct. Brad and I decided that we would test that out if the chance came about. The lights don't always show up. We arrived in Saratoga much earlier than we had expected, so we decided to do some exploring. We stopped at this general store and bought some candy chip soda and some bug spray, and then took my tiny little car out into the trails in the Big Thicket Preserve. We passed oil derricks, abandoned and operating, and kept taking the creepiest looking roads further into the wood. Eventually, we see a sign marked Teal Cemetery and decided that was good enough for a destination to kill the remaining daylight before going light hunting. The road was narrow, not just unpaved, but muddy and scary in a two-wheel drive tiny car. It was flanked on both sides with forest so dense that it looked like night between the trees. Eventually, we came to a large circular clearing with a square fenced-in cemetery in the center. We parked my car and got out. The moment that we got out of my car, we both felt an instant sickness and fear. Every instinct that I had was telling me that this place was bad. Very bad, and that we should get back in the car and drive very, very fast out of here. The mosquitoes were so thick that you could hear a loud hum coming from the forest. I looked at Brad and he nodded. "I feel it too, man," he said. "I guess this is our campsite then?" I asked. He grinned uneasily and nodded, and then we began exploring the cemetery. There were so many weird things in that cemetery. I remember walking about and seeing a place where a couple thin decorative trees and bushes had grown in an odd fashion. It was like they were making a bubble, like a little yurt or something. My head was telling me that it was nature covering something from sight, trying to erase it. I got down on my hands and knees and crawled into the interior of the bubble, brushing leaves and limbs away, and saw that even the grass was growing in that weird fashion. It was covering up a gravestone. Not one of the standing ones, but one of the flat ones, lying face up into the earth. I reached out to brush the grass aside so that I could read the names and dates on it, but as soon as my hand touched the stone, there was a loud noise. It sounded like a vibrating, buzzing sound. The stone itself felt like it was vibrating under my hand. It was like a high-speed fan was under it, and the tiny blades were clacking it very rapidly. The sensation and sound scared the crap out of me, and I leaped back and immediately crawled out of the bubble. I looked about for Brad and didn't see him at first. He had gone back to the car to grab the cigarettes. I waved at him to come over and he nodded, moving towards the chain-link fence. And then he stopped. A weird expression came over his face. He was standing outside the cemetery looking in, looking at something on the ground. "Martin, come over here, where I'm looking," he said. I walked towards him, and when I got a few feet away from the fence, I saw it. It was a large, rectangular hole in the ground, about the size of a grave, but much more raw and rough. "Is that what I think it is?" he asked. "I don't know. I don't think so," I said. I looked at the hole carefully. It was deep, but not terribly so. Maybe 4 feet at the worst of it. There were weird grooves on the side and a smaller rectangular hole in front of it, running the other direction. As Brad approached, I had an idea to lay in the hole. There were chunks of rotted wood stuck in the clay, but not much. It was about the right fit. When I reached my arms up to climb out, they sank into natural grooves. My fingers even found finger holes there. I pushed myself out. From Brad's expression, I saw that he noticed the implications there. "That has to be a prank. Nothing is that perfect," I said. He nodded. I still mostly believe that today. Brad and I continued exploring the cemetery, noticing some old graves back from the Civil War era. And then both of us saw a path into the woods, past the fence at the back of the cemetery, opposite the road that led us here. "We're going in," I said. Brad grinned and we hopped the fence. Both of us had grown up out here. Both of us had about 2 decades of horrible experiences out there, and both of us had almost died from these things before, but this was our obsession. We walked into the forest. The footpath led us maybe half a mile or so into the woods, just enough light coming down to see clearly, and then we saw something that made us forget everything else that we had seen so far. A perfect circle straight ahead, in the middle of a very lush and thriving, very alive forest, there was a perfect circle of dead. The ground looked like dried clay and sand, cracked despite the almost constant rainfall. The leaves that had fallen in weren't just brown and dried like those outside the circle, but black and rotted. We looked at the trees and bushes. Some had branches that had penetrated the circumference of the circle. They were living in grain until the breach, and then crumbling to dust. I looked around, looked at Brad, and then stepped into the circle. The moment I did, all sound stopped. The crickets and cicadas had stopped their humming, and the sounds of the mosquitoes stopped. Even the rustling of the trees stopped. I got a sick feeling in my stomach again, a brief, dizzy spell. Brad was staring at me, a little concerned. I shook my head. "I'm fine. Hand me that stick," I said, pointing at a large, jagged, heavy log. Brad picked it up and handed it to me. "Something's buried in here. I don't know why, but I just felt certain that there was something under there." I grabbed the stick with both hands and began busting the large clods of earth up and flinging them out of the circle. As soon as I did that, Brad and I heard an insanely loud roar come from deeper into the woods, almost like a bear but louder. My heart started racing and we looked at each other, and then we heard something far, far worse. Something big, very big, running through the woods at us. We could see the pine trees being shook and pushed aside deep into the woods. "Go, go!" Brad yelled, and we both ran, probably faster than we ever had before or since, back up the path towards the cemetery. The crashing and stopping, Christ, you could almost feel the vibration in the ground, following us and catching up. We hit the clearing, and I've never been terribly athletic, but I vaulted over that chain-link fence into the cemetery without a single ounce of difficulty, and ran towards the gate, and my car just passed it. The thing didn't follow us out of the forest and into the clearing, but we could feel its presence, and anger, rage even. And we bolted to my car. It started right up, and we drove very fast down that road until we got out of the woods. The entire way out of there, it seemed like shadows were following the car, keeping pace in the woods beside us. We got out, drove to the highway and the entrance to Bragg Road, and confirmed what we both saw to each other. Our experiences matched. We smoked, drank our sodas and waters, and calmed down. Darkness had fallen by this point, so we decided to go down Bragg Road and continue the look for the lights. We did see the lights from a distance, but never got close. They all seemed to be moving backwards towards the preserve, and we presumed the cemetery. Eventually, we decided to go back. I wish I could say that something more exciting happened when we returned, but unfortunately no. We got back to the cemetery and it was dark. The same sick feeling like we were being watched, but nothing else. We soon decided that we were pushing our luck well past the point of sanity, and we left to go home. Last year I went back to Saratoga and managed to find the cemetery. The hole and grave wasn't there anymore, and neither was the bubble. The path was there, though not in the place I remembered it, and we did find the circle. I took some soil samples. I might take some pictures of them and post later. Thanks for reading. I'll have more tomorrow. At the bottom of one side of my family's hill, there was a really poorly made one-story red house. The families came and went from that house, and most didn't make it past a year or so, because once the floodwaters came, the house's roof would be 10 feet underwater. It was always in some form of disrepair or another, and family after family of redneck or white trash would move in and out of it. Most took to dumping trash in the ditch across the road. There was no carpeting or hardwood. If anyone had ever been dumb enough to install it, The multiple floods had long since destroyed them, so it was simply concrete flooring and warped wooden walls, windows, and doors. I remember the driveway was covered in white shells. The house always smelled bad too. Generations of flooding and molding wood will do that. I had known some of the families that had lived there over the years. Some even had kids around my age that I would play with. I learned pretty quick never to get too attached to the kids because usually they would move off after the first major flood. The land had a fairly large pond on the side that led to a large and strange natural pit. The pit was lined with clay and only occasionally had water in it. We used to pretend to be cave explorers and climb down into it and explore the weird tunnels until we hit water or found our way to the creek that ran behind all of our properties. My friend Aaron and I would play back there, actually more especially when it was vacant. Later on, my friend Patrick would join us as well. We loved playing in the woods, building forts out of pine trees, swinging on vines across the cliff. It was kind of awesome in its own way. All of us knew about the weirdness, but I suppose we adapted the same way people who live in dangerous neighborhoods or cities and they still go for walks. You know, it's dangerous, but it's still home. You can get used to anything, I suppose. I've always loved going for long walks. Living way out in the boonies like that, no one really worried about it. No one worried about being kidnapped or anything. And they knew that I knew the back roads in the woods like the back of my own hand. So sometimes I would go walking through the woods or the roads for hours at a time. Sometimes I would have my little Walkman. Sometimes just thinking or enjoying the scenery. I still love to walk. My hips and legs are a little jacked up from a car accident that I had a few years back, but I still do it, still enjoy it. On one day when I was about 12 or 13, I was returning home down our road after one of these long walks. I was passing the red house and I glanced over at it. It had been empty for a year or more and was in an even worse state than usual. The windows were completely clear of glass or screens. The doors were wobbly and the house had this derelict, dirty look about it. Not overgrown much, just a few tall weeds here and there. I got curious and decided to go look in, see if anything had been left behind after the last family had moved. I remembered the sound of the shells crunching underfoot, and there must have been chalk on them or something, because they left this white dust on everything that they touched. I pulled the front door open. Actually, the front of the house didn't have a door. It was the side covered by a porch, and I walked in. The house smelled of dust, mold, mud, and rot. Not overwhelming, but I could imagine how difficult it must have been to live there in that constant scent. The house was mostly barren. A few rotted posters were up, but that was about it. I walked through the bedrooms and bathrooms, keeping an eye out for snakes. I wasn't too worried. The only snakes that bothered me were cottonmouths, and you could smell them a mile off. They stink terribly. I was in the heart of the house when I heard a loud bang. It was the sound of the door slamming shut. I immediately began moving through the house stealthily, trying to avoid being seen. I could hear slow, steady footsteps moving through the house, making no effort to be quiet. I reached the back door and tried to pull it open, but it was stuck. Now, I want to be clear that it wasn't magically forced closed or anything. The frame and door had just warped it, and it was very, very hard to open. I finally forced it open and ran into the backyard and moved towards the road. I looked back and saw a figure on the porch, just silently watching me. The figure was at first like the shadow things that I had described earlier, but I was able to get a much better look at it through the empty windows on the closed-in front porch. It was tall and gaunt. Its skin was gray and wrinkled, almost desiccated, like a man aged far past the point of normal human life. It wore a black, wide-brimmed hat, and the eyes were like green fire, balls of green light. That was the only time I saw something with that description. I did hear others describe something similar later on in life when I began asking my own questions. I'll be back tomorrow evening with another story. Thanks for reading. I mentioned in earlier posts how even after all these disturbing incidents that my friends and I continued to walk in the woods, camp out there, and eventually started actively seeking this out. I compared it to how you normalize living in a violent neighborhood after a while. We all used to camp in the woods past the creek, far behind my house. Those woods were strange, and it took me several years to notice some of the strangest things about them. In fact, it wasn't until I moved out and started really thinking about the layout of the land that the really bizarre aspects became noticeable. I'll describe that and then tell of a particular incident out in the woods. So, from my back porch, you could walk down the hill away from the road past my pond and then hit the cliff, across the creek, climb up the other side of the cliff, and then enter the forest proper. It steadily climbed upwards, the trees getting more and more thick, pine and hardwoods both. If you kept going, it became less pine and more hardwood, and it took on a completely different appearance. Then going further on, you would hit rocks, fallen trees, what looked like a former dried-out swamp, and another cliff that we never went past. The land past there was rocky, mostly barren, and you could see what looked like rocky hills or maybe dark mountains off in the distance. They were too far off and mostly uninteresting compared to the woods. And this was a few miles of walking before you would even hit that. The weird bit is, it should have only been a mile or so before getting to the highway, and there are no mountains or rocky hills out there. But we all saw this multiple times and just sort of accepted it. None of us ever really went very far past the end of the woods to the barren rocky parts, not out of feeling creeped out or anything, just a complete lack of interest in doing so. It was years and years later when I was on a job and driving past the highway that the turnoff into my old homestead was on that it suddenly dawned on me that we never hit the road. We never got out of the woods. I called a few friends of mine and brought up the mountains, and oddly enough, they remembered them, and it was only me bringing it up that brought their attention to how strange that was. One year, my big brother and I cut down some smaller trees, fashioned a crude hut out of them. I brought some stones from some of the ditches up there, made a fireplace, and even used ropes and things to coax some of the smaller, more malleable trees to grow sideways for a while to make living seating. This became our regular campsite. I had walked out there after school to relax, smoke cigarettes, later on some pot, and just to get away. And Patrick and I had been camping out there often, almost every weekend for a while. We would play out there and either sleep out there or come home and bored to watch movies and play some video games. Sometimes when we were out there, we would see the shadow things, usually off out past the clearing that we had built or up in the trees, watching us. It was usually very, very brief. Just a few moments of seeing a human-shaped figure just at the edge of the light watching us, and then turning and vanishing into the woods. And one night it got worse. We had my stereo out there loaded up with D-cells, listening to CDs and smoking cigarettes that I had stolen from my mother. We had a fire going, but it had gone down to embers, and since there was a stone enclosure, we never worried much about it. Between the stones and the almost constant rainfall out there, forest fires never seemed a threat. Patrick and I were laying back, music playing, talking about whatever was on our minds when I noticed 3 of them high up in the trees watching us. Patrick? Yeah, I see them too, Martin. We had gotten used to being observed for a time and then left alone, so we kept our eyes on them. And then we heard snapping twigs and leaves from further off in the woods and saw more of them. They made us nervous. They had never been quite so bold before. We stood up and heard more and more of them coming out of the woods. We stayed in the enclosure for a while, wondering what to do. And then both of us felt a surge of panic at the same time when we bolted through the woods. As soon as we did, we could hear something running behind us. I remember feeling something hitting my back. By that point, I could just make out the distant light of my house, far up the hill and past the cliffs. Something hit my back again and I fell. falling face first down the cliff, knocking the wind out of me. Patrick just jumped, helped me to my feet, and we continued running, now in the clearing of the backyard until we topped the hill and got inside. My clothes were muddy. I had avoided rolling into the creek, but the foliage was wet and the ground was kind of muddy. I took my shirt off and saw that it was covered in blood. Patrick looked scared and told me to go to the bathroom. There were several claw marks down my back. They healed up pretty well. There's still some faint lines there today, but nothing major. Just enough to free bleed for a while. We slept in the house that night and the next morning walked back out there to grab the stereo. Everything was just as we had left it. Oddly enough, even after that incident, we still kept camping out there. Sorry, this one is kind of short. There will be more tomorrow. Sorry about the 2-day delay. This has been an absolutely stressful weekend and I had no time to write. I still barely do and I didn't sleep much. I'll post a much longer one once I've rested a bit tomorrow. A long winding creek wove its way through the small community that I lived in. The same creek ran under the bridge behind the house and under 2 more bridges before leaving my road. A few minor tributaries also ran through the woods themselves. The bridges that went over these were mostly creosote-soaked wood with metal cord guardrails. 2 of them were completely without guardrails and driving over them could get nerve-wracking. We used to play under those bridges as a kid, building dams, forts, or just hiding out smoking. One year, one of our neighbors had the clay ditch lined with stones full of quartz, so we used those, sticks, and everything else that we had to create the dam. It's still there over 20 years later. Changed the course of the creek a little bit, and I'm proud of that. The woods on the other side had their own weirdness. We had to be more careful in those particular sections of the woods because they weren't on private land. We would still wander around them, though, and I'm fairly confident that my friends and I knew the woods better than anyone else. One particular place always stuck out. My brother had shown me when I was a kid. We would walk down the first bridge, jump down, and then walk past and over the creek and to the left and eventually find this covered pavilion with a tin roof and dirt floor, an old sink and a hand pump. Years later, I took my friends out there occasionally. We would bring food and drinks, sometimes even camp out there. When I moved out of state, I missed the places terribly and would tell my wife about the beautiful woods and the campsites. Over the holidays one year, my wife and I drove back home to visit my family and friends. During this trip, she wanted to see some of those places that she had heard about, so we drove out to my neighborhood with Brad. We told her some of the stories of the weird things out there, some of which have already been posted here. We parked next to the bridge closest to my old house and decided to walk around. It was probably about 9 or 10 at night. Brad left the tape recorder on the hood to see if we could get anything weird while we were away. We left the windows down and started walking further down the road. Brad and I showed my wife, long since divorced, some of the areas that she had heard about. We checked out under both bridges, walked out to that pavilion and to Brad's old home. On the way out of the woods, my wife started getting nervous, swearing that she could see things in the woods. Brad and I assured her that if we stayed calm, we could get to the car before anything happened. We were smoking on the second bridge when we saw figures walking down the road. We started walking back to the car, looking back to see the grayish, vaguely human shape. We were walking fast but not really running. The thing was keeping pace with us, and then my ex, she just lost it and bolted. As soon as she did, we heard rustling from the woods running next to us, trying to cut us off at the turn before we reached the car. I unlocked the doors and ran around to get into the driver's seat. I hopped in and heard my wife scream and saw her getting pulled from the car. I grabbed her arm and pulled her back. She slammed the door and we drove off. After leaving the thicket, we talked. The reason that she had taken off running was she had looked over the bridge and saw something that looked like a large skull. She described it as about 3 times the size of a normal human skull, on top of a body made of what looked like tree limbs, vines, leaves, and rotten vegetation. She said that it looked like it was about to climb onto the bridge, though she ran. She didn't see what had grabbed her. She believed it was that thing. After arriving at the house, we listened to the tape and heard something strange. You can hear us talking, laughing, and walking away, and then you hear us driving off. There's nothing in between. Just a seamless transition between us walking away and walking back. Although we experienced at least 2 hours of time, only 2 or 3 minutes passed. Even my wife's scream didn't show up. Only the sounds of us closing the doors, nervously talking and driving off. This next story is a bit shorter and not nearly as dramatic as some of the rest. I hope that nobody is too terribly disappointed in this, but I felt it was important to describe some of the more simple, less dramatic events that took place out there. Previously, I had touched upon the weird spatial issues with the land. I described how we never hit the highway even after crossing miles of land. I also mentioned the landscapes that don't actually exist out there. Sometimes other things in that vein happened. Sometimes it felt like we had left our area and suddenly entered somewhere else. Patrick and I had once read that closed structures, particularly natural triangles, were problematic to walk through, and one should never do this. I'm still somewhat phobic of that to this day. I walk around my city regularly and still have the habit of watching for triangular formations. Sort of an OCD type thing, but you'll soon see why I have this phobia. I will break this routine if I'm with somebody that I care about and they cross through. I'll follow them through and try to keep pace with them. It's strange, it's insane. And this is why I harp upon why I don't really study this stuff anymore, and why I feel like my time out there almost completely ruined me as a person. A friend of mine described it almost like a mild case of PTSD, but I don't want to go that far. Patrick, Aaron, Brad, and I spent a lot of time exploring the woods behind my house. One day, Aaron and I were going to the furthest edges of the family land and discovered a very well-built deer stand. Closed in, nice little clubhouse. It was still very much our land, so we felt absolutely zero guilt painting it and claiming it, and even booby-trapping it again in case the poachers came back. And we would bring picnic stuff, tools, and spend all day out there, landscaping a bit, making it suit us more. One day we came back and found that the booby traps had been sprung. I think the poachers got the message and never returned after that. There was one summer morning where Patrick and I walked out there, spent several hours reading, talking, and just goofing around in the woods. We got hungry and decided to head back. About halfway, something seemed a bit off. It was hard to put our fingers on it, but something wasn't right. The colors of the sky looked slightly off. The sounds of the forest were a little different. Nothing that most people would ever notice, but we grew up out there and knew that area so intimately that any difference became noticeable. We grew ever more and more uneasy as we left the woods. We crossed the creek and began the climb up the hill towards my house. My house was painted green, it always had been. My house was still green, but kind of a yellow-green. The old Jeep that my dad left behind was gone. The trees were a little off place. It was my home, but just off. And Patrick and I started to go towards the house to investigate further, but both of us got a very bad feeling about getting too close to the actual house or the barn. We both turned and went back into our woods, retraced our steps, and found our way back to the deer stand. We smoked some filched cigarettes, calmed ourselves, and then walked back in a different route. This time, things felt right, but after discussing things together later on, we both felt that we had nearly avoided something terrible. I'm not sure what happened there. This could very well have been just overactive imaginations. We never saw any shadow figures or other things, just that feeling of things being slightly off. Sorry too if the posting has slowed down. Things have been difficult lately. I'll try to write more often, and one of my friends who was mentioned in this series might be taking the reins in a separate but connected series, and I'll add some comments there. I'll link to that series whenever it gets around to it. My current group is wanting to see these places. Sometime soon we'll travel out there so that I can show them. Whenever that happens, I'll take pictures and I'll post a story about it. Also, if anybody is interested in me answering questions or filling in any blanks that might have been left in these stories, feel free to leave me a question in the comments and I'll answer to the best of my ability. This next story is kind of a wraparound. For some reason, I felt like I was increasingly more and more of a target out there. Possibly it was just my constant proximity. Possibly I just didn't hear from others going through the same regular events. It became more and more frequent until I finally moved out, and some of the events seemed directed specifically at me. I would be in my room sometimes and hear people talking outside. Sometimes a serration, sometimes actual words. Occasionally it sounded a bit like people that I know. I was worried that the stress was getting to me and my mind was cracking, but others heard similar things out there when alone. The most common voices were the sounds of young children laughing and playing. There's an old creepypasta out there that I swear was written by someone that I've either known or talked to this stuff about with before. I think it's called Upstairs. A similar event happened to me at my house. I was home alone and heard my mother calling me from inside another room in the house. I called back and she just repeated my name, calling me again until I got up to go look for her. As I was about to enter that room, I heard my mother's car pulling up and I saw her parking. Things like this happened fairly often. Between that and being chased through the woods multiple times, the man in the red house, all of this, it seemed like I had more experiences than most people. Everyone saw things, just not nearly as often as I did. As I got older, I began to get obsessed with tracking down where all these things were coming from. I never definitively found the source, but there was a spot that always worried me. There was a pond in my yard at the bottom of the hill, close to the creek that bisected the land. It was on the right-hand side if your back was to the road and you were facing the woods. There was a ditch that ran all along the fence line on that side that had weird things all through it. A gate that led to nowhere. One day, that gate vanished with no explanation. Pieces of houses were out there, and we were the first people to live out there, and we had cleared the land. There were no spaces for houses in from the age of the trees, not for hundreds of years. And finally, this small wooden wall made of very, very old wood, with a small door or portal where the rain went down right at the edge of the pond. These oddities weren't even really in the woods. They were in my backyard on the fence line that ran between the road to the drop-off. That little wall portal thing always gave me the creeps ever since I was a kid. I had a reoccurring dream or maybe memory of being in the canoe and desperately trying to paddle backwards away from it while being drawn towards the thing. I was never sure if that was just a dream or an old memory, but whenever I was near the wall, that scene would play out vividly to me. I was so scared of that wall, but also strangely drawn to it. A little ways down the road, let's call it Broadcloak Road. It was actually named after my last name, but my last name isn't really Broadcloak. There was yet another abandoned house. A little shack even smaller than the red house, but not nearly as low, so it didn't go underwater when the floods came in. I remember my big brother once had something to do with the house. I'm not sure if he worked on it, stayed in it for a while. I really doubt that. While it wasn't as decrepit as the red house, it wasn't really in livable condition. Or maybe he just hung out there with his friends when he was my age. I would occasionally explore and look around the house, never going in. Bushes and thorns had covered the entrances, but wandering around outside it and trying to peek in. There was another much smaller pond a little ways down from that house, natural wood going gray, and another odd hole in the ground that sort of reminded me of that wall and portal down by my pond. The house was creepy, but not the absolutely terrifying place that some of the others were. Sinister, otherworldly almost, dangerous even, but not the feeling of absolutely must run. Well, that changed one night. One day I went to bed. I don't specifically recall what I was doing when I went to sleep, but at the time I think I did. I don't think there's a specific blank spot in my memory. I think that the 2 decades have just faded at this point. I woke up cold and uncomfortable. I was not in my room. It was very dark around me and I could smell earth and stone. My night vision was excellent at the time. I had some eye surgeries as a child and some botching in them caused my eyes to get a bit more light than most people. I could read in a dark room. And nowadays my vision is degraded actually for the same reason. 30 plus years of getting that much extra light has damaged them further. I could see, but just barely. I was scared, but I managed to not completely panic. Off in the distance, I heard running water and decided to move that way, figuring that I might be able to climb out of some runoff hole. As my eyes adjusted a little further, I could see that I was in some kind of tunnel. Mostly clay, some rock and some root systems breaking through in a few places, so I knew that I wasn't too deep, just a few feet underground. As I got closer to the running water sound, I started getting more and more panicked. I felt like something was in there with me. I didn't see or hear anything, just this feeling of some presence down there with me. My feet hit water and moonlight was spilling in. I could see the sky. And that's when I got very, very scared. I could see the boards of that wall near my pond. I had walked a good distance at that point. I looked around and saw some water running down, I presume from the pond. Just a small stream going downwards. There was an even deeper pit leading further down, and that was where I felt the presence was coming from. I stared into it, even my eyes couldn't see much around me, much less down that hole, and I suddenly felt like something was wrong and that I needed to leave. Later on, I thought perhaps whatever it was waking up, but that's just speculation. I ran the other direction, banging into the walls until I saw light again. The hole was lined with thorns near the top. I cut myself up pretty bad, but I got through and found myself near that old house, emerging from that hole that I had mentioned earlier. I had traveled a fair enough distance, but still only maybe a 5 or 10 minute walk from my house. I walked back, cleaned the dirt off myself, and watched the sun come up. Talking to my family later on, long after we had moved, I found out that many of them also experienced weird things similar to mine. My entire family heard the children laughing and playing often, especially my grandmother who died when I was 1. My grandfather mentioned seeing a gray-skinned man to me once, shortly before he died. The other voices were mentioned, the weird structures were just overlooked. I think something compelled me to sleepwalk down into that tunnel. I think that was the moment that things started targeting me. Some other things happened later that showed some strange connection that I have with the events out there. We moved out of there when I was 16. We sold the house to a nice young couple, kind of redneck, but they were sweet. I saw them only once a couple years later and they looked a bit haggard. The man whom I had gotten along with very well was nervous around me. He finally told me that they had been experiencing haunting-like incidents, but then they mentioned seeing me around, a younger version of me. He knew that I lived out of state by then too, but it made him nervous to be around me. Things didn't go so well for that couple. The stress wound up driving him insane. He wound up going berserk. His wife left him. He went gun crazy and shot up his own truck. He got involved with some teenage girl down the road who kept cattle and land recently cleared behind that gray house until committing suicide in the barn. The Trinity River cuts a very deep ravine close to where I grew up. When I was very young, we used to go play out on the banks, boat, fishing, camp out there. When I became a teenager, it became a popular destination for parties. I guess the riverside version of a beach party. Lots of tents, kegs, etc. My friends and I camped out there occasionally. Sometimes when the water was high, we would load camping gear into the boat and follow the creek until it connected to the Trinity. There were some nice, really isolated spots out there, perfect for a campfire and conversation. The banks were tall and really steep, especially on the opposite face. 20 to 30 foot drop off at the shortest, sometimes much higher, and at the top of the cliff, the forest resumed. And this part was a very thick forest, very old and completely blocked off from the light from the treetops. And Patrick and I liked exploring a lot and used to set up camp and then boat further down, looking for interesting things. One time we went out there and found an old decrepit house, 2-story, insanely weathered, slightly leaning off to one side. We anchored the boat to a log and climbed the cliffs to look at it. This wasn't that unusual. It seemed like there was a small community out there, possibly around the late 1800s to the very early 1900s. Occasionally, the course of the river would shift a bit and the cliff location would shift with it. I think most of the houses got lost in a landslide a long time ago. To find one of those houses in that good of condition was kind of insane. Most of the others were little more than rubble. The house was 2-story and very overgrown with weeds and bushes, and even trees that had grown into the house in a few parts. Only one window still had glass in it, and Patrick and I cleared a path up to the house and started wandering around looking for anything interesting that might have been left behind. There wasn't much. We found a few pieces of glassware, an old lamp, some broken furniture, including a rocking chair that must have been nice at one point but was too rotted to sit in. This was wintertime, otherwise we wouldn't have gone in. Old houses and shacks are really great places to find clusters of cottonmouths, rattlesnakes, or copperheads. We had discovered that very early in life, so going into closed places like this was only a wintertime activity. Upstairs was kind of interesting. We were both nervous that we would fall through the stairs to the floor, but it held fairly well. The floor did sink a bit in places and you could feel the entire house shift every so often. We guessed it only had at most a decade before it fell over entirely. And there were only 2 rooms upstairs. What must have been a bedroom with a small closet and another small room, the purpose of which we never discovered. Maybe a child's bedroom or a study of some kind. The floor was covered in old stains that looked like blood, but we just assumed it was decades and decades of water, mold, and other crap. There was one really odd thing that was old scars in the wood on the floor and wall in one part of the bedroom. No splinters anymore, but large hack marks, deep grooves in the wood like somebody had cut into it long ago. We joked that it was the site of an axe murder and then laughed. And Patrick and I were always thrill seekers, so we packed up the tent, gathered a firewood, and relocated back to the old house. The fireplace was stone and brick, so we figured it would be safe for a small campfire. We set up my radio, listened to music, set up a fire. Thankfully, the chimney wasn't too blocked, and we sat on the porch, smoking and drinking the few beers that we had caged. And we were both getting older and both knew that we only had a couple of years or so until one of us both moved and these trips became either rare or extinct. So we talked about that mostly. And we were off school for a few days, so we decided that we would camp in the house that night, explore a bit in the morning, and maybe go get paint and building materials out from my barn the next day. And over the next year, work on fixing the house up a bit and making it our vacation house. We were very happy with our discovery. We both crashed out fairly early, unrolling our sleeping bags and falling asleep to Pink Floyd on my old boombox. I'm not sure how long we were asleep, but I remember waking up confused and feeling immediately nervous and scared about something. Patrick was awake too. I could see that he was also feeling the same. We both woke up and started packing. We were rolling the sleeping bags up when we heard a creak from upstairs. We froze, wondering if it was more of the same stuff or if some lunatic had come in while we were sleeping and was messing with us. We started moving towards the door when we heard a loud scream from upstairs, a woman screaming and a man shouting. The man was shouting something, it sounded like English, but I didn't catch any of it. Heavily accented or just full of rage, I don't know. We heard loud banging and crashing and the scream stopped. At this point, Patrick and I were quietly trying to leave when we heard footsteps moving towards the stairs. We ran towards the door and the footsteps followed after us. We ran to the cliff face and Patrick jumped down. I tossed down the radio and he caught it. I took a look back and saw a figure in the door staring at us. All I could really see is a white face and huge, dark eyes. It made a move towards us and I jumped down. We were in the boat and pushed off in record time. We never returned to our vacation house. So, I posted 9 chapters worth of incidents set out in the general area that I grew up. I'm going to post some pictures as soon as I get a few. A lot of you have requested that. I've been asked a lot about what I think it is, and I honestly do not know. I've had several theories about this over the years, and I would like to go through those and highlight a few examples of events that made me adopt that theory for a time. This post will ramble a bit, and it'll act as a sort of conclusion to the series. And today I also want to highlight several small events that I think tie things together a bit more. Sort of a putty filling in the cracks of the main stories. I would also like some feedback. It seems like there's a lot of you out there who've had experiences in the same area. It's been amazing seeing that many people from my neck of the woods. Please share your stories with me below. I would love to hear them and share any input that I would have that would be appropriate. Also, thanks for telling me about that David Pauliage researcher. Over the past few days, I've been listening to interviews with him, and some of the information this man is sharing is insanely similar to the events that I either experienced out there or heard stories about. Aside from the possibly supernatural incidents out there, there's also a creepily high rate of violence and degradation out there. I told a story in a previous post about the man who had bought my house degenerating into a psychopath. I also mentioned the brother of my friend who went from basically petty theft into attempted murder, and how in both cases I think there were connections to the thing in the woods. My next door neighbors, the ones about halfway down the hill, I've mentioned them before. They were the drunks that went out in Saratoga, and I mentioned the lights cutting them. The dad was always a bit weird. I think over the 10 years that he lived next door, they eventually got divorced and he moved away. I never really shared any words with him. I knew my mother disliked him a great deal and had zero trust in him. She didn't like the mother either, but she was okay with me being around her. I remember when I was a kid, she told me that if he ever came to pick me up from school that I was to not get in the vehicle with him. If it was just the mother, I would be okay. She didn't explain why, and it was only about a year ago that I heard the reason why. Once when I was very young, my parents were having a few drinks over at the neighbor's house, and the man got very, very drunk. He got weepy and shouty and started babbling about how he had killed a bunch of kids out in a town about 50 miles away. My dad dismissed this as crazy drunk talk, but my mother called the police in that town the next morning. She had asked about missing and murdered kids and was transferred to a senior officer who confirmed that there were a bunch of kids about that age who had either gone missing or were found murdered. She asked if they had a suspect and told the officer what the neighbor had said. The detective said yes, that they have a description of the man they are almost sure had killed them, and then they proceeded to describe a man completely different from our neighbor. My mother sighed in relief and said, "Oh, thank God, that's not this man at all." The officer asked her to describe her neighbor and she did. The officer was quiet a moment and then said, "Yeah, that's him." He had lied about the initial description to see what she would say and not influence. I'm guessing this is about the time that I stopped seeing him around. I think whatever out there causes people to go insane and violent. I'm not sure if it's just the stress of these events, or if the thing is actively screwing with their minds, or if the presence of these things just kind of causes a form of cancer, like living next to a nuclear reactor or something. Kids go missing all the time, When I was 16 and got my first car, I remember driving to school early in the morning and seeing 2 police cars and an ambulance with the lights off next to a ditch by the highway. They were pulling a kid, only a few years younger than me, out of the water. He was ripped apart. I remember his skin being blue, a bluish white. He had gone outside to take out the trash 3 weeks earlier. His house was isolated and nobody noticed anyone come or go. Just went out to the burn barrel and was never seen alive again. A kid that I knew from school was shot by his own father. A hunting accident. Shot him through the window of his own truck. That neighbor who kept hearing voices coming from the woods until he kidnapped that old woman. Also, there are a lot of deformities out there. The nearest town had a large population of people with absolutely hideous deformities. I used to joke that it was like living in H.P. Lovecraft's Dunwich. A relative had somebody break into her house once. Thankfully, she had a sibling staying over and they scared the intruder off after beating her over the head with a stick. They found a bag of equipment, sex toys, and restraints in the house. My longest running theory is that whatever is out there has been there for a long time. It's some form of local life and either doesn't have a set form or can project illusions into your mind. It would explain the skinned man in my aunt's attic, the sounds coming from outside or in the cellar, the man with the glowing green eyes, and so on. The shadow people might be projections, or they might be like avatars for it, almost like video games. But how would that explain the woods being so vast or impossible to traverse without hitting man-made landmarks like the highway? How would that explain the same mountains seen by both myself and my friends so many times over the years? Many times I've had the theory that it's a genius low-key, some form of intelligence created by the land itself, but I'm still not sure. The search and rescue poster described seeing staircases in the woods and parks. I never saw staircases, but I knew exactly what he was talking about. We found train tracks out in the woods in an area that hadn't been cleared in centuries, if ever. There was absolutely no way train tracks could be out there. No roads and no pathways, and no place for them to come and go. You would hear them sometimes too. The last little bit that I'll leave you with is about one of the neighbors. He was further down the road and moving towards the highway. We always referred to him by his initials. I forgot what they were, but I'll just say JD. Again, he was a little bit slow. Had a little 2-story house near one of the bridges. I don't know what he did for a living, but I remember people just described him as harmless. We would see him off and on, either driving through to or from the house or riding our bikes. He would always smile and wave. I remember that he used to use cocoa powder like a tobacco dip, and always had a bit of chocolate drool going down his chin. I was scared of him as a child. The bridge close to his house was also really creepy. The same creek that ran behind my house ran under that bridge, and it was a massively steep drop-off. 30 feet down, and the bridge was one lane with no guardrails, only 2 or 3 inch bumps. Cars went off that bridge occasionally. About once a year, some idiot would be barreling down these dark roads and take the turn too quickly, or be weaving from booze and go right over the edge head first. Usually they did not survive. JD either died or went to a state home when he was about 9 or so. Patrick, Aaron, Brad, and I used to wander around his yard occasionally. I don't remember who it was that was with me when we finally went into his house, but I won't forget what we found. There was a collection of women's jewelry, wallets, watches, and teeth up on a shelf. I don't know where he got them from, but I'm almost certain that they were taken from those crashes. I just couldn't get the image out of my head of JD sitting on his porch, a line of cocoa drool going down his face, that same goofy, cheerful smile on his face, watching a car go off the cliff and casually strolling down to pick stuff from the still alive people. I don't have much time, so I'll try to crunch as much info as I can. This lock can only hold this thing back for so long. My name is Icarus, a rather suiting name knowing what I got myself into. Let's start off with where it's at. The school is located in Texas. Not saying which town, just please avoid any and all abandoned schools in Texas, for I don't know if this thing is in each school. Please understand, I don't want anyone to go out like I'm about to. So this all started as a joke at first. In old school, my friends wanted to check out and do like a ghost hunting video in. We never thought we'd actually go since most of us were still scared of a loud sound. It wasn't until Tyler, the oldest in the group, said that he recently had bought a few laptops, a bunch of cameras, and a few spirit boxes. It's really just a fancy recorder. Anyhow, he seemed like he really wanted to do it. And so we got together as a group. It was Tyler, John, Rick, Alicia, and I. We all sat down and read all the ghost stories online. It really only involved being cold or the occasional scratch or two. Plus Tyler said, if we get some of these things on camera, we'll go viral and be big in no time. I was the only techie guy there, so I was to handle the tech and set up the YouTube channel where we would post all of this content. Tyler was the strongest one, so he pretty much carried all the stuff that I just set up. John, Rick, and Alicia all were to bring food, water, and first aid kits just in case. I know John was in JROTC, so he had legitimate first aid training. Let me describe the layout of the school. It was 3 stories high. Each floor had the same design except for the first, since it had a basement and a small boiler room. The other 2 floors above had your usual, about 20 rooms each and 2 sets of bathrooms on each floor. We had enough cameras to log each hallway and bathroom, but as the rumor has it, the basement and the boiler room is where all the action really kicks off. One more important note why the school is haunted is because about 40 years back there was a massive school attack there. 19 children had lost their lives. This included the perpetrator. Now, this was before big media could handle the issue, and the local government paid the families outrageous sums of money to keep Texas's top school from getting blacklisted. They said it wasn't much longer when kids ended up going missing in the area. Some kids would go to the water fountain and just disappear when no one was looking. This too was covered by the school board as they went missing after school hours. The school board held a vote the next year to close the school down. Maybe they couldn't bear the thought or guilt of more children being lost. Shortly after, the school became a local legend, and how these souls of the children are trapped in it. All local legends are over-exaggerated, where one person trips on a rock and suddenly there's a ghost who pushes people down. However, this one seemed legit. It is a hidden gem in the ghost hunting community, as it is very secluded and hidden to the public, so really only locals know about it. There are reports of a scratching, pushing, possession, and even what people call a hellhound, as its large black dog with bright red eyes. We arrived at the school ready to go. We have enough food and water to last us a few days, just in case someone really wanted food. And we also brought all the tech and tripods for the camera. Rick's dad had a generator that was in his shed. It was old and dusty, but it ran just fine, which was perfect to keep all the equipment juiced up. I brought my mobile hotspot so we could go live on YouTube, or just post in the account once it was all done. Plus, we have to keep in touch with our parents. I decided to set up base camp in the first floor as a bathroom. It looked still put together besides some broken glass that was easy to sweep away. Once we got set up, Tyler, Rick, and I went to each floor to set up the cameras while there was still some light out. We ran the wires and turned them on, record once we got back to the hub, and then we waited, which took a few hours since we got there at 4 p.m. and sundown wasn't until 6 p.m. Time passed by slowly with nothing showing up on the cameras yet, so we all started telling ghost stories to pass the time. Most of them were really silly and made zero sense. Like, why would anyone lock themselves in a room that they can't get out of? Isn't it ironic? Well, it wasn't until 7:35 p.m. when we had our first sign. Guys, we have movement on the second floor," Alicia said excitedly. We all rushed by the second floor laptop where we saw just a shadow going in and out of the doors of the bathroom. It was moving quickly as if it was running. "I gotta go live on YouTube, we're gonna be famous," I said. I quickly tabbed over and refreshed the page, to only get our live access denied. "It's okay though, since our channel was new we can just upload it later," Tyler said. Looking back, he was so optimistic all the time. I set all the cameras to record and to signal us on any movement that was detected. As soon as I did, all the cameras dinged at the same time, letting me know something was moving on all of them. So we all chose a camera to look at. The second and third floor were firing off with tons of activity. Shadow people, orbs, random debris being tossed and doors closing and opening. It was very off-putting how it all started popping off. I got an eerie feeling. Like, have you ever had this sense of approaching or overwhelming dread? I started to sweat and panic. Everyone was so happy. "We're gonna be famous," Rick yelled out. Alicia and John were jumping up in joy, yelling stuff like, "Heck yeah, make some noise, it's gold." I looked at Tyler. He was white as a ghost. He must feel it too. I decided to pull him to the side and he saw my face and how worried I was. Now, this was out of character for Tyler to be scared. I've known him all my life and he's always been the protector type. I was the nerd and he was the big tough but lovable jock. Tyler was a senior and I was a junior. He always had my back and he was always by my side. So, when I know that something is wrong with him, I know. Tyler, yo big guy, snap out of it, we need to talk." I shook him. In doing so, he looked down and blinked a few times and with a straight face he said, "We need to leave now." He rushed to the laptops and grabbed them, and the other part of the group was shocked. "What the heck, man, we're gonna be famous," said John. Tyler stared them down with anger. "You idiots, I'm trying to save us, we need to leave now. Forget the cameras, we can come back later in the daytime." Everybody gulped and saw that he was serious. And Tyler and I started jogging out, and I had one laptop and he had the other. We were about to make it when we heard Alicia scream. I opened my backpack and threw my laptop in it, and ran back in there without a second thought. I heard Tyler yelling at me, "Stop, they're already goners, you idiot." I don't know what came over me, but it felt as if my body was moving on its own. As if my will to save my friends outweighed my fear of death. I got to the bathroom. In front was John. At least, it was just his face. It was peeled off like an orange and tossed aside. I could taste the copper in the air, and I could hear Rick crying in the bathroom. "No, please, we're sorry. Please, I don't want to go out like this." I can hear in the background the sound of Alicia gurgling. I don't know why I didn't just run. I had to see for myself. It felt like a dream, but it was really a nightmare. I slowly and as quiet as I could went into the bathroom, and I saw John's body flayed like a fish. I barely could hold back my vomit, and I could feel my vision blacking out, and then I felt a hand on my shoulder. I spun around and before I could scream, Tyler covered my mouth. We used sign language to communicate what was going on. I never knew just learning this on a whim would ever come in handy. "We need to get out and grab Rick while the thing is busy with Alicia," Tyler signed to me. "I know, but how will we do it?" In the background, we heard a loud crunch and Rick could be heard throwing up. It sounded like a watermelon popping. It took her head off. I could hear the squelching of it coming out of her neck. "Icarus, we need to stay focused. I can distract the thing. I saw it running on the first floor cams and it isn't very fast." I shook my head. "What did it look like?" It doesn't matter now, but it's not a wolf. Go hide in the girls' bathroom. I will lure it out and I'll meet you outside. I shook my head. Be safe, bro. I signed back. We got into position, and we could hear the thing still going at it on Leisha's body. I see Tyler as he gave me a thumbs up and a smile. This was the fakest smile that I had seen him do. And then he waved to me and hid. Hey you, ugly thing. I know you're in there, why don't you come out for me? The sounds of bone and crunching stopped. It started laughing. You sound delicious. That sound shook me to my core. I could hear it walking out of the bathroom. It must have stepped on John as popping and cracking could be heard, followed by the plopping of its feet. You better start running. And catch me if you can, loser. Tyler started booking it as quickly as he could. I only caught a small glimpse of it, but it was a pale man. He was without clothing, but with no real body features either. He had very long arms that scraped against the floor, and he was covered in a red hue despite being nearly white. I could smell them as he ran by. He was rancid and the smell lingered in the air. As he chased my friend, I could hear him laughing. Oh, this is fun. Run, rabbit, run. Once I couldn't hear him anymore, I ran to the other bathroom and saw Rick crying in a stall. I grabbed his hands, but he was covered in blood. Rick, are you okay? We're gonna get out of here, buddy. It'll be okay. Icarus. He removed his hands from his face and his eyes and nose were gone. Icarus, I've seen the face of God. He came here to punish us for looking into the veil. I'm doomed. You must leave. I snapped out of my trance and grabbed him by his arm and quietly said, No, we are leaving, not just me. I won't lose another friend. I hoisted Rick up and we slowly started to walk to the exit. Where were you going, little rabbits? I slowly turned to see. The thing had caught up with Tyler and was dragging him by his hands. He looked cut up but not eaten, however, and he was unresponsive. I don't know what came over me, but I yelled out at the beast. Screw you. Haven't you taken enough? Those kids 40 years ago, all those kids after who went missing, is it not enough for you? Rick pulled away and fell into the fetal position. No, it's never enough. I will always be hungry. Always. The thing let out a bellow of laughter. It looked straight at me and then to Rick. You brought me a snack. I love when they're afraid. It makes them so much more satisfying. It was then he let go of Tyler and reached towards Rick. I saw Tyler launch up and drive a large metal pipe into its nag. Tyler grabbed my hand and ran, and we ran into the basement. I could hear the thing crying in the background. You, I'll get you. We go into the basement and lock the door. Tyler, at this point, was losing a ton of blood. He had been beat up pretty bad. I go to see him carefully holding his stomach together. I start to cry out and I yell, Tyler, no, not you. This can't be happening. He looked at me and with his other hand, he placed it on my shoulder and then coughed and said weakly, Iggy, listen carefully. There's nowhere to go. I want to say this. He starts to pass out. I shook him carefully. What? What do you want? I said. He just looked me in the eye and says, Icky, you're my best friend. I never told you, but I love you, dude. I really do. I'm madly in love with you. I couldn't help but cry as I grabbed his face with one hand and he smiled. I'm in love with you too. And we shared a smile, and I leaned in and had my first kiss. It was shortly after that he passed away in my arms. I don't know what to do. I'm stuck in this basement with this laptop and my Wi-Fi hotspot. I hope this gets through to someone. I'm happy that I got to tell Tyler my final feelings, but I can hear this thing breaking into the door. It won't hold any longer, and I have no chance. Tyler, I hope that we meet somewhere again in the ether. Whoever gets this, please heed my warning. Stay out of any old abandoned schools. I love you, Tyler. I'll see you soon. A week or so ago, I was driving down to Texas. It was a long drive, one that would take 2 days unless I drove nonstop throughout the night. However, I was eager to reach my destination and chose to tough it out for the sake of getting there sooner. The drive started out relatively normal. I drove for a couple of hours south and I felt good. I had my music cranked in a cooler full of energy drinks in the passenger seat. When I saw the sign saying, "Now entering Tennessee," I thought that I was making record time. I must have forgotten to watch the clock though, because the sun began to set. I was partially confused, mainly due to the fact that I had left earlier in the day, but I disregarded it as the idle distractions that I had created for myself to pass the time, faster being the cause. Something else odd I noticed was the open freeway. Normally, I would expect to see many vehicles all traveling to different places, but instead, I seemed to be the only one out and about. Still, I wasn't feeling tired and I'd already committed to driving straight through the night, even if things seemed strange. But as I drove on, I realized that the sun had set far too quickly, and with the lack of other vehicles on the road, it looked like I was driving in a void. The blackened world around me was only illuminated by my high beams, but I could only see perhaps 15 feet ahead of me. There were a few normalities like guardrails and mile markers, but if something were to appear in front of me, I would likely hit it because of my lack of visibility. So I pulled over. My vehicle came to a subtle halt on the side of the freeway as I turned on my emergency lights. Realistically, I knew that it wasn't a fog. It was just dark, darker than the world behind my eyelids. I suppose that I wanted to see another car pass by before I concluded that something had gone wrong. But none came. I waited for more than 20 minutes and not one car or truck barreled down the freeway. I decided to roll my window down and allow some fresh air into my car. Plus, I was slightly panicking because I did have somewhere to be and this was taking up a precious time. Suddenly, the engine shut off. Even the accessory power had gone cold. I performed some percussive maintenance by smacking my hand against the dash, as if it would magically fix everything, but it obviously didn't. And then I heard a quiet ticking sound. You know the sound your fingers make when you tap them against a table? It was like that, but instead of the soft, fleshy contact you would get from the skin of your digits, it was more like the clicking of nails against plastic. My intuition told me that it was coming from under the hood, and therefore I would have to step outside. But just as I was about to open the door, I almost had a heart attack because hanging over the trim of the window sill was a hand. I freaked out and flung myself into the passenger seat on top of my cooler. The hand was tapping its pale white fingers against the inner part of my door, and after my initial fear had died down, I thought that it may have been someone looking to help me. Foolish, I know, but I did have my four-ways on. A part of me knew full well that another vehicle hadn't pulled up behind mine while I was distracted by the engine malfunction, but I still inquired, "Hello? Who's there?" The finger stopped moving, and the hand slipped down slowly over the side of the door and out of sight. I waited while trying to catch my breath before asking again. "Hey, who's there? Why are you messing with me?" No sound. Not even crickets responded to me. I turned my head to peer out of the rear window and I couldn't see anything, which made me wonder more as to who was outside of my car. My ear was pressed against the passenger window, and just as I was about to slide back into the driver's seat, I heard the tapping a second time right next to my ear. I nearly got whiplash from the speed at which I turned my head to look out the window. There wasn't anything there, in terms of a tapping hand, however. There were fingerprints left in the condensation on the outside of the glass. My heart raced and I crawled back into the driver's seat and tried to stupidly roll the window up, even though I quickly realized that it was futile. Then I started to hear footsteps in the gravel on the side of the asphalt, but when I looked in my mirror, I saw nothing. That was until my headlights came on without warning. They flashed brightly ahead of me and illuminated the figure of a human standing directly in the light. But I couldn't see who it was because they were missing their head. The headless torso held out its thumb as if it were hitchhiking. However, it only did it for a moment before beginning to approach my vehicle. I tried to start the engine, but for some reason my key wouldn't crank. And then I thought, if the headlights are on, then surely I should be able to at least roll the window up. It moved slowly, the body that is, towards me with a shambling, unstable gait. Unfortunately for me, my window wouldn't go up. Even when fiddling with the key in the ignition, I started to panic and sweat began forming on the palms of my hands. By the time it was at the front corner of the driver's side, I decided that I would get out and confront it. As I reached for the door handle and pulled, I found that it wouldn't open. I have one of those stupid pull-up locks that sink into the door, so I wasn't able to grip it and force it up. The electronic unlock didn't work either, so my only option was to climb out of the window. The problem was, it had already reached my side mirror. There was no way I would be able to crawl through the window without that thing grabbing me. So once again, I slid into the passenger seat, with my feet poised to kick if it tried to worm its unnatural way inside. From there, I could see it was a masculine body that was exceedingly tall, and it wore a gray sweatshirt laden with holes. It had scuffed pants with tread marks denoting a tire had crossed over them at ludicrous speed. If I had to guess, I would say that they had been run over. As it tried to reach its arm inside, I kicked it away. It didn't appear to have much more than primal instinct, because it stumbled back and took some time to regain itself. Still, regardless of the fact that it was a brainless walking corpse, I was still terrified. When it reached inside the second time, I scooted myself towards the driver's seat and forcibly jammed my foot against its chest, sending it falling to the ground. I used the opportunity to get out of the car via the open window and run around to the trunk. I couldn't open it without the key, which I had stupidly left inside, but at least I could get away. But as it rose to its feet, I felt an immense pressure in my head, as if somebody were squeezing my brain. My vision became blurry, and different parts of my body burned with a fiery intensity. Every time that I tried to move one of my limbs, I couldn't, and the paralysis weaving its way through my body made me an easy target. The headless torso continued shuffling its disjointed feet in my direction with an outstretched hand, but the other was held low with its thumb out. Suddenly, my faculties snapped back into my control, and I was able to avoid its mindless descent by stepping to the other side of my vehicle. I don't know what made me think the car would start if I tried again, but despite my former failures, I awkwardly jumped inside and turned the key. My eyes widened with joy when the engine turned over and followed by the familiar rumbling of the vehicle running. I threw the shifter into drive and slammed my foot on the gas without hesitation, and I sped off into the dark. I thought that I was in the clear, and my breathing slowly returned to normal. It was odd that some strange part of me thought that maybe it was just a ghost that was asking for help. But that was highly improbable, and now I know that wasn't the case. The freeway was still obscured by the all-encompassing darkness, but I didn't care. I just kept on driving. And then my heart skipped a beat, because standing on the side of the road was the headless person. I drove by but couldn't see them in my rearview mirror due to the darkness. I took a breath and I drove on, without trying to think about it too much while taking a look at my clock to see what time it was. It read midnight. Great, I said aloud, still maintaining a relatively high speed. My hands were firmly gripping the steering wheel and I kept thinking that it was over, but I was wrong again. Like before, I saw the body standing adjacent to the freeway, with an outstretched thumb. It started walking into the road as if it were trying to be hit. I avoided it and continued on, completely freaked out. I took a peek in my rearview mirror and I could have sworn it was sitting in my back seat, but as I quickly glanced over my shoulder, it was only an empty seat. My paranoia was somewhat satiated when I saw it again, but now I was holding something in the hand that didn't have its thumb out. As I drove by, I narrowed my eyes to see it closer. It was holding a smiling head. At this point, I was close to fainting from the fear. I just wanted this horror loop to end, but as that thought crossed my mind, I heard something heavy fall onto the roof of my car. I jumped in my seat, startled by the sound, and I looked up. Obviously, I couldn't see anything, but I could hear movement and I could sense the weight lurking above. Regrettably, during all the chaos, I had still forgotten to roll the window up, which I admit was entirely my fault, much to my dismay. I say that because the sound suddenly stopped and I thought that it was over once again. But when I looked to my left, I was met face to face with the severed head. The body was on the roof, holding the head in my open window. I yelled and it tossed the head inside, and it latched onto my thigh, biting deeply into my muscle. It laughed maniacally and I nearly crashed, trying to deal with both the head and keeping my vehicle on the road. I yelled out in pain and began pounding my fist against the back of the head. Luckily, one of my attacks dislodged it from my leg, and I grabbed onto it with my free hand before throwing it out the window. All at once, the darkness lifted, and I was able to see the head bouncing down the freeway in my mirror, followed by the body that it belonged to sliding off my roof only to tumble to the road. I was breathing so hard that I thought I might lose consciousness, and my leg was bleeding pretty badly, but I dared not stop. I started to see other vehicles, and that's when I finally allowed myself to feel any sort of relief. The events that I had experienced shocked my system, and I decided that I would pull off at the nearest town and get a motel for the rest of the night. When I found one, the lady at the counter said, "Your face is so pale. Are you okay?" I looked deeply into her eyes and said, "There was a man, or rather, a body on the freeway, without a head. It terrorized me and it nearly killed me." She stared at me for a moment before bursting into laughter. "Oh, you young people. You always have the craziest stories. Although I do seem to remember someone else saying something about a body on the freeway once." My eyes lit up. "What? What did they say? What happened to them?" Well, nothing happened. We called the police, but they found no bodies, nor did they find any evidence of an accident. The person ended up leaving the next morning, and that was that. Huh, I uttered softly. I got a room for the night and I dressed my wound. It wasn't as bad as I had originally thought. It had to have been the lighting that made it look worse. I stayed until around early morning and then I checked out with barely any sleep. Now, I'm telling you to avoid driving down any freeway if you're going to Texas. I mean, I can't say for sure what the catalyst is, but something to do with my specific trip caused me to experience this horrific anomaly, and I just want to warn everyone that I can. Although the lady at the counter did say that someone else had experienced something similar, I just don't know, and it's better to be safe than sorry. What's even worse is that when I was about to get into my car to continue my drive south, I noticed a fresh handprint pressed firmly against the outside of my driver's side window. I guess I'll be sticking to day driving from now on.
My parents never took me anywhere. I had never left our small town before the age of 25. And once I did, and I realized just how much I love the road. Most truckers will tell you that they have a list of freaky shit a mile long that they've seen while on the road. And in my 30 years, I thought I had already seen the worst. I was so unbelievably wrong. I was on my way from San Antonio towards Dallas after making a 7 o'clock drop-off. I still had a few hours to go when I stopped at a small diner off 35. I had missed lunch that day and I had to piss like a racehorse. I pulled my rig into the gravel lots and I parked around the side of the building. I locked up and I jogged inside. When I first got inside, there were a few things I noticed right away. One, the restaurant was completely empty. I don't mean that there was only a few tables of diners. I mean there was nobody. There were no waiters, no cooks, no anyone. I took a second look at the door to see the open sign blinking red. I found my way to the bathroom to relieve myself. I figured if anything, I would just use the restroom and leave to find a McDonald's or something at the next exit. However, when I exited the bathroom, I was no longer the only person in the restaurant. Sitting at the bar was an older gentleman. His gray hair was neatly gelled away from his face. He had a dark gray suit that was fitted nicely onto his slender frame. He appeared to be in his 70s, and he was taking a drag of a cigar as I stepped out. He didn't immediately acknowledge my presence, but after taking another drag, he looked over at me. He nodded lightly and he patted the stool beside him, gesturing for me to sit down. I was hesitant at first, but I figured the guy was probably harmless. I walked over and I sat down beside him, looking around for any other employees, but I saw none. "Can I get you a drink?" he asked, his voice lower than I expected, and gruff from what must have been years of chain smoking. "Oh, just a water." He eyed me for a few seconds. His dark brown, wrinkled eyes scanned my face up and down a few times before he made a move to stand. I noticed that he used a cane as he made his way around the counter to the sink. As he began to fill up my cup, he glanced back at me. "We don't get a lot of customers here," he said, sitting a full cup of water in front of me, leaning his arms onto the bar, watching me. "Do you work here?" I asked, taking a small sip. The man chuckled softly. "Sort of. I own it." I nodded and I looked around once more. "How long have you been here?" "As long as I can remember," he answered, standing up straight. "You hungry?" he asked, turning away from me. "Yeah, I could go for a burger or something." The man nodded and disappeared to the back for a few minutes. He returned with the juiciest burger that I'd ever seen, accompanied with a pickle and a side of chips. He gently sat it in front of me, and then slowly made his way back around the bar to a seat beside me. I quickly dug into the meal, realizing just how hungry I was. The man watched me for a few moments before speaking up again. "What's your name?" I swallowed the bite in my mouth and I glanced over. "Steve," I said quickly before shoving more burger into my mouth. The man nodded slightly. "I'm Nick." He pulled a cigarette out of his suit pocket and lit it. He held it towards me, offering a hit. I politely declined and I finished up my food. "Thanks for the dinner. It was delicious. What do I owe you?" I asked, standing up. Nick looked over at me and he smirked. "Son, people who want more than just a meal." I stood awkwardly, unsure how to respond to that. Okay." Nick stood up and he walked over to the entrance. "Food is not what you truly desired tonight." I stared at him for a few seconds, unsure if he was joking or just totally off his rockers. I laid a 10 on the table and I walked towards the door, brushing against him as I shoved it open. I began to make my way to the parking lot, towards my truck. Glancing back at the diner, Nick was still standing at the entrance, grinning widely. I climbed in my truck and I drove off, glad to be rid of the strange place and its owner. Nick remained in my mind for the rest of the night. A lot of the drive was just empty road, no real identifying marks. So, I thought it was weird that I had driven for about an hour and had only come across one other building. I really had to pee again, and another small diner was the only building I'd seen. I pulled in the lot and I got out, rushing inside. I almost pissed my pants then, and there when I looked around. The diner was empty. I looked over towards the bar area, seeing a familiar gray head of hair. Nick spun around to face me and he chuckled softly. "Nice to have you back, Steve." Now, I was partly scared and partly furious. "What the fuck do you want with me?" I yelled at the man. "How did you do this?" Nick stood up slowly and made his way over to me. "It's what you want, not me." He gestured to a nearby booth and I reluctantly sat down across from him. "So, Steve," he started, "tell me a little bit about yourself." I did not have time for this. "Bite me," I said harshly, almost spitting at him in the process. I wasn't sure why I was so angry, but perhaps my fear had just manifested in that way. How could I be at the same diner that I'd driven away from over 50 miles ago? Nick shook his head, laughing softly. "Steve, Steve, Steve." He looked up, meeting my eyes with his dark ones. I knew they were brown, but they were so dark that they almost looked black in the low setting of the diner. "Don't be so hostile. I'm trying to help you." I studied his face for a moment, trying to find some kind of sign that this was some elaborate joke. Perhaps some camera crew was going to jump out of the back, tell me that I was on some new prank show. No camera crew ever came. "I don't understand," I said softly, finally calming down enough to try to rationalize things. "There's something you want, and I can give it to you, my boy." I looked up at him once more. His face showed no expression. It was virtually unreadable. I had no idea what he was talking about, so I repeated my previous statement. "Tell me about yourself, Steve, and maybe it'll begin to make sense to you then." I looked down at the table. I hadn't talked about it before, but I was ready to. If it got me out of this shithole, I'd do anything. I've been a trucker for 30 years now. Nick nodded, leaning back in the booth. "Why?" What kind of question was that? I like driving. He studied me for just a half a second before nodding. "You like driving or you like running?" What is that supposed to mean? Nick shrugged, folding his arms over his chest. "Exactly what I said." I glanced out of the diner window, looking out towards the interstate for a few seconds before Nick cleared his throat, bringing my attention back to him. What happened before you became a trucker, Steve? I looked down at the table, unable to make eye contact with him. I had a family, I said, almost whispering. You did. A wife and a beautiful daughter, he said, a smug look on his face. I snapped my head up. How did he know that? Nick must have caught on to my surprise pretty quickly because he responded to the question I hadn't actually asked. I know everything, son. Then why did you ask? I said, beginning to get angry again. Because you have to be the one to say it. Yeah, I had a wife and a daughter, but they're gone now and they've been gone for a really long time. Nick nodded, leaning forward, resting his elbows on the table. And what happened to them, Steve? They're dead. From a fire. Nick watched me quietly for a few moments. I'm very sorry to hear that, Steve. He wasn't lying. He was being sincere in his sympathy. I nodded quietly, not meeting his eyes. I don't mean to be a buzzkill, Steve, but nice people don't end up in my diner, he said, abruptly ending the awkward silence that had been occurring. I looked up at him. What? Nick folded his arms across his chest once more. What really happened that night, Steve? I shook my head. I already told you, it was a fire. Faulty wiring, I said, leaning back in the booth. Nick nodded once more. I could finally make something out of his face. He was thinking. The gears in his mind were turning as he thought of his response. You don't believe that, he finally said. Of course I do. Nick chuckled softly. But we both know that wasn't actually what caused the fire. He sat up straight, leaning in close to me. We both know that coincidence is what saved your ass. He laughed softly again. Did the faulty wires pass out with a lit cigarette as well? I stood up, shoving the table towards him hard. What are you insinuating? I yelled, getting in his face. I grabbed him by his suit collar, his cane falling to the ground. I drew back my fist, ready to hit him. It was a drunken mistake, Steve, he said to me, not even flinching at my sudden outburst. I looked over him. Who are you? Nick laughed quite loudly this time. If I told you, you'd never believe me. I let go of his shirt collar, picking up his cane for him before straightening him up again. What is it that you want? Nick leaned against his cane, watching me. I already told you. It's about what you want. I watched for a minute, before chuckling softly to myself. You can't give me what I really want, I said to him, looking him in the eyes. He didn't break eye contact as a wide smile spread across his face. Try me. I stared at him for a long time, searching for any deceptiveness. I found none. I sat back down at the booth and I sighed deeply, staring at the ground. I felt tears prick in my eyes as my throat swelled a bit. I want them back, I croaked out. Nick watched me for a long time before speaking up again. I can do that. I looked up at him, tears now actively flowing down my cheeks. That's not funny. Nick shrugged. Who said I was joking? I stood up, getting in his face again. Do not mess with me, old man. He held his hands up defensively. I'm not. I let go and he crossed his arms. I can give them back to you for a price. I rolled my eyes before locking eyes with him again. What's the price? I asked, genuinely interested in what this crazy old bat would want. Nick chuckled quietly. Well, Steve, all I want from you is your soul. My soul? I asked, almost in disbelief. Yeah, it was official. This guy was insane. After you die, of course, Nick said, making sure I fully understood the terms. I'd come to collect in another 30 years. I laughed loudly. This old bag wouldn't even be alive in 30 more years. Hell, He looks like he could drop over in the next 30 minutes. So, if I agree to give you my soul after I die, you will bring back my wife and daughter from the dead. I couldn't even believe I was saying this. Was I in some kind of movie? Perhaps I was dreaming. Exactly. Nick replied, short and sweet and to the point. Who are you? I asked, wondering what kind of drugs this dude was on. I'm the devil. He responded, far more casually than I would have expected. I looked at him. So, you're the devil and you want my soul? Nick shrugged. Yeah. I shrugged. Hell, I won't need it after I die. I laughed again. If I agree to this, will you let me go? I just want to go home. I needed to entertain him, humor him so I could get on with my life. Hopefully, I'd leave and never have to think of this weird night ever again. Nick nodded, extending his hand to me. Yeah, you won't see me for another 30 years. I shook his hand firmly. It was far hotter than I'd expected. I quickly withdrew my hand, looking as it turned beet red. It looked like it was burned. When I looked back up from my injury, Nick was gone. Not just that, the entire diner was gone. I looked around. I was pulled off into a small field. My truck parked about 100 yards away on the side of the road. I looked around once more, but saw nothing in any direction. I quickly jogged back over to my rig and I pulled back onto the interstate. I drove straight home, not wanting to stop again for fear I'd never make it back. I arrived around midnight, which is nearly impossible considering the drive was 4 hours and I'd spent at least 2 in that stupid diner. It should have been closer to 3 or 4 in the morning, but no. It was like that I never even stopped on the way home. As I unlocked my door and I stepped inside, looking around in the dark, I flipped the light switch on and I kicked off my boots. Steve, is that you, sweetheart? I heard a voice call from upstairs. I froze. That wasn't just anyone's voice. No, that was Christina's voice. My Christina. The one that I'd lost all those years ago. I heard the patter of little feet scamper across the floor upstairs. Daddy? This wasn't possible. My little girl had died 30 years ago. She was only 7 and the prettiest girl that I'd ever met. I thought every day how I had taken her life from her and her mother. Christina, Marie, I called back, in disbelief at what I was hearing. Was it possible that Nick was telling the truth? He really was the devil. It meant that I really had sold my soul. It didn't matter now though. I had 30 years before I had to pay up. I had 30 years to spend with my family. 30 years I thought I'd missed out on. I was deep in thought as my wife and daughter finally made their way down the steps. I realized then that Nick was without a doubt the devil himself. I had made a deal with the devil, and the reason I knew was because he was notorious for being a trickster. I looked over my wife and my child, trying not to vomit. Their skin was black and charred, falling off in chunks all over their body. Their clothes were melted and fused into their skin, and they absolutely reeked. I knew then and there that these next 30 years with them would be worse than the 30 years spent grieving over them. They were now a constant reminder of what I had done. And the worst thing of it was that I had sold my soul for this. And I think I know exactly how he's going to kill me. I may as well take the smoke detectors down now.